"Since you could not give us an heir, this marriage is over." My husband's father declared those words loud enough to silence the entire room. When I opened the heavy folder, he slid across the dining table. Divorce papers stared back at me. I looked at my husband, seeking some kind of defense, but he simply stared down at his wine glass like a coward. Silently, without shedding a single tear, I picked up a pen and signed every single page. Then my best friend stood up and handed my husband's father a brown envelope. The color completely drained from his arrogant face as he read what was hidden inside. "My name is Melanie, and I am 33 years old. For 7 years I endured the suffocating weight of my husband's wealthy family." Before I continue this story, let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. Hit like and subscribe if you have ever had to stand up to a toxic family who severely underestimated your worth. Connor was 35 and a vice president at his father's massive commercial real estate firm. His family, the Montgomerys, lived in a sprawling mansion that felt like a museum. The polished marble floors and crystal chandeliers were beautiful, but the atmosphere was always freezing cold. The annual Thanksgiving dinner was a perfect example of their oppressive lifestyle. Everything was meticulously planned to project absolute perfection. Harrison, my husband's father, sat at the head of the table like a king presiding over his subjects. At 62 years old, he was an arrogant real estate mogul who believed his money allowed him to control everyone around him. His wife, Catherine, sat at the opposite end. At 60 years old, she was a socialite obsessed with lineage bloodlines and maintaining an illusion of superiority. She never missed an opportunity to remind me that I came from a middle-class background. We were halfway through the main course when the tension in the room suddenly shifted. I had invited my best friend Jasmine to join us because her own family lived out of state. Jasmine was 33 and a sharp corporate attorney. She sat quietly next to me, observing the strained family dynamics. Harrison cleared his throat, setting down his silver fork with a loud clink that echoed in the quiet room. He pulled out a thick leather folder. He slid the folder down the long, polished table. "Since you could not give us an heir, this marriage is over," Harrison declared, his voice booming with authority. The brutal cruelty of his words hung in the air. I slowly opened the folder. Inside was a complete set of divorce papers already drawn up and waiting for my signature. I turned to look at Connor, my husband of 7 years. Instead, Connor slouched in his expensive chair. He refused to make eye contact with me. He just cowardly lifted his crystal wine glass and took a slow sip, letting his father do the dirty work. He was a spineless executive who cared more about his inheritance than his wife. Before I could even process the betrayal, Catherine chimed in from the other end of the table. Her face twisted into a nasty sneer as she looked at me. "Ashley is already 3 months pregnant with Connor's son," Catherine announced with malicious pride. "Pack your bags tonight and go back to your pathetic public sector accounting job. We finally have a proper mother for the Montgomery legacy." The revelation hit me like a physical blow. Ashley was 26 years old and used to work as a receptionist at Harrison's commercial real estate firm. She was Connor's mistress. For 5 years, I had subjected my body to countless hormonal treatments. I took injections that left me bruised and exhausted. I sat in sterile waiting rooms, reading magazines while doctors analyzed my blood work. Every single test came back showing that I was perfectly healthy and capable of having children. But Connor refused to get tested. He threw violent tantrums whenever the doctors suggested it, claiming that a Montgomery man could never be the problem. Harrison and Catherine supported his delusion, constantly implying that my middle-class genetics were somehow flawed. I spent countless nights crying myself to sleep, feeling inadequate and broken. Little did I know Connor already knew the truth. He had known since his college days that he was sterile. He deliberately let me suffer through years of agonizing medical procedures just to protect his fragile ego and maintain his image in front of his demanding parents. He watched me break down in tears month after month, knowing full well that he was the reason my dreams of motherhood were failing. His betrayal was not just an affair. It was a deep psychological abuse that spanned the entirety of our marriage. I had suspected the affair for months, noticing the late-night text messages and the unexplained weekend business trips. But I never confronted him. Instead, I did what I do best. I investigated. Catherine thought I was just a lowly public sector accountant who filed tax returns for municipal workers. She had no idea about the true nature of my profession. For the past 4 years, I had been working as a senior forensic auditor for a highly classified federal financial regulatory board. My job was to dismantle corrupt corporate empires, track hidden offshore funds, and build airtight federal cases against white-collar criminals. When I first suspected Connor of cheating, I started looking into his personal finances. What I found was a tangled web of deceit that went far beyond a simple affair. I uncovered massive financial irregularities within the Montgomery real estate firm. Harrison had been embezzling millions of dollars, hiding toxic debt, and funneling illicit funds through a network of shell companies. I spent months building a federal case against my own husband and his father, operating in complete secrecy. I gathered every piece of evidence, every hidden ledger, and every fraudulent bank transfer. I built an arsenal of truth while they were busy plotting my removal from the family. Harrison sat back in his chair with a smug smile, clearly expecting me to break down into tears. He wanted me to beg for another chance to scream or to cause a dramatic scene that would validate their narrative of me being an unstable outsider. But I did not give them the satisfaction of seeing me cry. A strange, powerful calm washed over my body. I reached into my purse and pulled out my favorite pen. The only sound in the room was the crisp scratching of ink against paper. I signed my name on the first page. I flipped to the second page and signed again. I methodically signed every single page of the divorce papers without a moment of hesitation. Connor finally looked up from his wineglass, his eyes wide with confusion. He had expected a fight, but I was handing him exactly what he asked for. I closed the folder and pushed it back toward the center of the table. That was when Jasmine made her move. My best friend stood up from her chair with absolute grace. She did not raise her voice or hurl any insults. She simply reached into her designer tote bag and pulled out a worn brown envelope. She walked over to the head of the table and dropped the envelope directly onto Harrison's plate, right next to his half-eaten turkey. Harrison frowned, looking at Jasmine with pure disdain. "What is the meaning of this garbage?" he demanded. "Open it," Jasmine replied smoothly. Harrison tore open the brown envelope. I watched intently as his eyes scanned the first document, the color completely drained from his arrogant face. His smug smile vanished, replaced by a look of sheer terror. The paper trembling in his hands was a set of medical records. They were Connor's official medical records from a private clinic. The documents proved beyond a shadow of a doubt that Connor had been 100% sterile since suffering a severe infection during his college years. He had zero chance of ever fathering a child, which meant that Ashley's baby, the precious Montgomery heir they were all celebrating, absolutely did not belong to him. Harrison stared at the medical records, his hands shaking violently. He looked at Connor, his eyes wide with a mixture of rage and confusion. "Is this true?" Harrison demanded, his voice cracking. Connor turned deathly pale. He opened his mouth to speak, but no words came out. The realization that his mistress was carrying another man's child, and that his entire family now knew his deepest, most shameful secret, completely paralyzed him. Catherine gasped, clutching her pearl necklace, as the illusion of her perfect bloodline shattered into a million pieces right in front of her eyes. But the medical records were not the only thing inside the brown envelope. Beneath the clinic receipts lay a thick stack of official government documents. Harrison pulled them out, his eyes scanning the bold federal letterhead. It was a direct subpoena and a notice of asset seizure. I wiped my mouth delicately with my linen napkin and stood up from my chair. I smoothed down my dress and looked directly into Catherine's horrified eyes. "I do not just do basic accounting, Catherine," I said, my voice echoing clearly through the dining room. "I am the lead forensic auditor for the Federal Regulatory Board, and I just froze every single one of your company's offshore accounts." The luxurious room felt as though all the oxygen had been sucked out of it. Harrison dropped the papers onto his plate, looking like a man who had just been sentenced to a lifetime in prison. Connor buried his face in his hands. I picked up my purse, gave them one last genuine smile, and delivered my final words. Enjoy the turkey. My name is Melanie, 33 years old, and still healing from wounds my wealthy husband's family inflicted. As a senior forensic auditor, I spent my life dismantling corrupt empires, but I maintained a polite facade at home to keep the peace. Last Thanksgiving, my husband's father leaned forward, smirking. "Since you could not give us an heir, this marriage is over," he declared loud enough to silence the room. When I opened the heavy folder he slid across the table, divorce papers stared back at me. I looked at my husband seeking defense, but he simply stared down at his wineglass like a coward. Silently, I picked up a pen and signed every single page. Then my best friend stood up and handed my husband's father a brown envelope. The color drained from his arrogant face as he read what was hidden inside. Harrison's face turns purple as my words sink in. He slams his fists onto the table, making the wine glasses rattle and spill liquid across the white tablecloth. He barks an order, telling Connor to block the doors. Connor scrambles out of his chair, knocking it backward, and throws his weight against the heavy doors. He points a trembling finger at me. He starts screaming that the medical records are a fabrication designed to destroy him. He tells his parents that I am just a bitter, barren woman trying to ruin their holiday because I am jealous of Ashley. He uses the word barren right to my face while sweat beads on his forehead. I do not raise my voice. I reach into my leather tote bag and pull out a stack of folded papers. I walk directly up to Connor and forcefully slap the documents against his chest. They flutter to the floor, but the top page lands face up under the chandelier light. It is a receipt from an exclusive fertility clinic in Boston dated exactly 3 years ago. It shows his signature authorizing the payment for a secondary semen analysis, which confirmed his absolute 0 sperm count. He knew. He had known for 3 agonizing years while I subjected my body to grueling hormone injections and wept in sterile clinic bathrooms. He let Catherine and Harrison relentlessly blame my middle-class genetics for our lack of children just to protect his ego. Connor stares down at the clinic receipt and the color completely drains from his face. Catherine stammers, trying to formulate an excuse for her precious son, but the undeniable printed proof is resting at his feet. Jasmine confidently steps up beside me, her presence acting as a solid wall of support. She looks at Connor with pure disgust before firmly grabbing the brass handles of the heavy oak doors, shoving his weak frame aside with her shoulder. We walk briskly out of the Montgomery estate, leaving the chaotic sounds of Harrison violently screaming at Connor echoing in the marble foyer. The freezing November air hits my heated face as we stride down the long paved driveway, and for the first time in 7 miserable years, I take a deep, full breath of freedom. Jasmine drops me off at a luxury hotel downtown. I need a secure, neutral space to strategize my upcoming moves without the suffocating, toxic presence of the Montgomery family breathing down my neck. I sleep better that night than I have in a decade. The next morning, I wake up feeling energized and ready to completely dismantle Harrison's real estate empire piece by piece. I head down to the hotel restaurant for a quick breakfast and confidently hand the waiter my primary premium credit card to pay the bill. A few minutes later, he returns looking incredibly uncomfortable and apologetic. He quietly tells me the card has been declined by the issuer. I casually hand him a different backup card from a separate financial institution. He returns again with the exact same regretful expression. Declined again. I step out into the hotel lobby and pull out my smartphone, checking my secure banking application. Every checking and savings account I share with Connor displays a 0 balance. My private personal savings account, which I foolishly linked to our joint checking system years ago, has also been completely drained. Connor and Catherine moved with astonishing speed. They maliciously utilized a legal loophole regarding shared marital assets to wire transfer every cent of my life savings out of my possession overnight. They aggressively want to starve me out financially. They know that fighting their team of corporate lawyers requires significant liquid capital, and they think that stripping me of my financial resources will force me to crawl back begging for mercy. I imagine Catherine sitting in her drawing room, sipping her morning tea, thinking she has permanently checkmated me. She severely underestimates what a senior federal auditor does for a living. I do not panic. I simply sit on a velvet bench in the hotel lobby and open my federal work laptop. I call my highest level contacts at the National Bank. These are the regional vice presidents who exclusively handle federal compliance and fraud investigations. I inform them that a massive unauthorized transfer just occurred across my personal accounts. When the banking executive traces the routing numbers, she gives me the exact piece of information I need. Connor did not just move the stolen money into a standard domestic account. In his frantic panic to hide the cash, he foolishly wired my entire life savings directly into the primary Montgomery firm corporate holding account. He thought burying my money within their massive daily operational funds would make it completely untouchable. Instead, he handed me the ultimate weapon to destroy them. I explained the situation to the bank executive. By intentionally transferring my clean, verifiable marital funds into a corporate holding account that is currently under an active federal investigation for massive embezzlement. Connor has committed a severe federal compliance violation. He has officially and illegally commingled clean personal assets with heavily audited, fraudulent corporate slush funds. I immediately log into my secure federal regulatory portal and type up a high-priority red alert. I legally initiate a hard federal lock on the entire Montgomery corporate banking network, citing suspicious illegal commingling of financial assets and potential international money laundering. The federal lock is instantaneous and completely unbreakable. Harrison cannot make his daily payroll. He cannot pay his numerous building contractors. He absolutely cannot transfer any hidden money to his offshore accounts. Every single cent of the corrupt Montgomery real estate empire is now totally frozen by the federal government until a complete forensic audit is officially concluded. Connor genuinely thought he was ruthlessly taking away my only ability to fight back against his wealthy family. But his sheer, arrogant financial incompetence just gave me the legal authority to entirely shut down his father's corrupt operation. I smile brightly, close my laptop, and gather my things. It is time to go to the federal office and expedite this investigation. I take a yellow cab straight to the towering federal building downtown. My sharp mind races with the exact procedural steps I need to take to formalize the permanent asset seizure. I walk through the heavy revolving glass doors feeling a powerful sense of righteous purpose. I approach the high-security turnstiles and tap my official federal identification badge against the electronic scanner. A sharp red light flashes repeatedly, and the thick glass gates remain firmly shut. I try the badge again, assuming it is just a temporary technical glitch. The machine beeps a loud, harsh rejection tone. The armed security guard standing at the front desk gives me a confused look and politely asks me to step aside. Before I can ask him to manually check my credentials, I hear my full name echoing loudly across the vast, pristine marble lobby. My direct department supervisor, Director Hayes, is walking swiftly toward me with a very grim expression. He is flanked by two large, armed federal security guards. I ask him directly why my security badge is suddenly deactivated today. He refuses to meet my eyes, looking nervously around the busy, crowded lobby. He quietly tells me that he received a direct, angry call from a prominent state senator early this morning. Harrison has been making massive illegal campaign contributions to this corrupt local politician for well over a decade. Now Harrison has desperately pulled those expensive political strings to trigger a targeted retaliatory strike against my entire career. Director Hayes hands me a manila folder. He tells me I am stripped of my auditing authority and placed on immediate administrative suspension. Harrison filed a formal complaint, falsely accusing me of leveraging federal resources for a personal vendetta. I am suspended pending an internal investigation into conflicts of interest. The guards step forward, instructing me to hand over my federal laptop and mobile phone. Harrison genuinely thinks he has effectively neutralized my immense power by taking away my security badge. He believes stripping me of my official government title will quickly force me into total submission. He simply does not realize that taking away my strict federal restrictions just made me infinitely more dangerous because I no longer have to politely play by their slow bureaucratic rules or show any professional mercy. Being sidelined from my federal duties did not break me. It untethered me. I walked out of that massive government building with a calm clarity that terrified even the security guards who escorted me out to the street. Harrison thought deactivating my badge would stop the bleeding. He had no idea that a federal auditor on administrative leave possesses the most dangerous weapon in the world, which is unstructured free time. By the time I returned to my hotel room, my phone was vibrating endlessly with notifications. Jasmine was the first to call, warning me not to open any social media applications. Naturally, I opened them immediately. Catherine and Ashley had wasted absolutely no time launching a vicious, coordinated smear campaign across every local high society network. They were desperate to control the narrative before the federal freeze became public knowledge. Catherine had mobilized her army of country club socialites, posting fabricated stories about my sudden mental breakdown. They painted me as a dangerously unstable and fiercely jealous ex-wife who was actively trying to extort a prominent charitable family simply because I was physically unable to give them a child. Ashley went a step further, posting pictures of herself looking glowing and maternal, alongside long-winded captions praying for my recovery from my barren delusions. They tagged local charities, media outlets, and influential community leaders. They wanted to humiliate me so profoundly that no lawyer would ever take my case, and no judge would ever believe my financial accusations. They thought public shame would silence me and force me into hiding. They forgot that I deal in hard facts, not public gossip. The sheer volume of lies they manufactured was astonishing, but it only fueled my determination to see them completely ruined. Every post, every malicious comment, and every fake sympathy message they broadcasted to the world was just another nail in their meticulously crafted coffins. I saved every single screenshot, compiling a massive digital archive of their defamation. They wanted a public war, and I was fully prepared to give them one that would scorch the earth beneath their feet. I spent hours organizing the digital evidence, ensuring that when the time came, their own words would be used to demonstrate their malicious intent and terrible character in a court of law. I decided not to hide in my hotel room like a wounded animal. Sunday brunch at the Oak Ridge Country Club was a sacred weekly ritual for Catherine and her elite circle. I knew exactly where they would be and exactly how they would react to my presence. I dressed with meticulous care, choosing a tailored emerald green dress that commanded attention and projected absolute unshakable confidence. I paired it with a simple classic trench coat and sharp heels, ensuring my appearance was flawless and intimidating. When I walked through the heavy glass doors of the club dining room, the clinking of fine crystal and silver forks ground to an abrupt halt. The silence was thick and heavy, like a physical weight pressing down on the room. Every pair of eyes locked onto me. I walked gracefully toward a quiet table by the window, ignoring the frantic whispering echoing around the room. Waiters paused mid-step, holding trays of mimosa glasses, unsure of how to handle the sudden tension radiating from the Montgomery family table across the dining hall. I took my seat and calmly ordered a sparkling water, projecting an image of total serenity. I had barely taken a sip from my glass when Ashley strutted over to my table. She was flanked by three of Catherine's wealthiest high society friends, acting as her personal bodyguards. Ashley rested her hands on her slightly rounded stomach, projecting an aura of absolute triumph. She did not even bother to say hello. She just slammed her left hand down on my table right next to my water glass. A massive custom-made diamond ring caught the sunlight and cast fractured rainbows across the linen tablecloth. It was gaudy, heavy, and incredibly expensive. Ashley leaned in close, her perfume suffocatingly sweet and overpowering. "Connor picked it out himself," she whispered with a malicious grin. "He wanted the mother of his heir to wear something worthy of the Montgomery name, unlike that pathetic little plain band he gave you." She laughed, a cruel, sharp sound that prompted giggles from Catherine's friends standing directly behind her. You really should have just walked away, Melanie. Now everyone knows how broken and bitter you truly are. You are an embarrassment to yourself, and you are making a pathetic scene by showing your face here today. You have absolutely nothing left to fight for. I did not flinch. I did not raise my voice or throw my water in her face. I sat quietly radiating a calm submission that I knew would completely disarm her. While keeping my hands resting casually in my lap, I subtly slipped my right hand into my dress pocket and pressed the record button on my smartphone. I let out a heavy manufactured sigh and looked down at the table, playing the part of the defeated broken wife perfectly. You won, Ashley, I said, my voice soft and deliberately trembling. You get the massive mansion. You get the prestigious name. You get the entire Montgomery fortune. You beat me completely. Her ego swelled instantly. The defensive posture vanished, replaced by a gloating, careless arrogance. She could not resist the urge to brag to a woman she believed was utterly destroyed. She leaned even closer, dropping her voice to a conspiratorial whisper so the older women behind her could not hear the gritty details. Please, she scoffed, rolling her eyes in exaggerated disgust. The Montgomery fortune is a complete joke right now. I know Connor is completely broke. His credit cards have been bouncing all week, and he has been sweating like a pig trying to hide his financial panic from me. I am not stupid, Melanie. I am only sticking around this sinking ship because Harrison made me a firm guarantee. He promised to set up a $2 million untouchable trust fund entirely in my name the minute the heir is born. He is so desperate for a pure bloodline legacy that he will pay absolutely anything for this baby. She patted her stomach again, and a wicked knowing smirk crossed her face. The funniest part is Harrison is paying millions for premium genetics, and he does not even realize this baby belongs to my personal trainer. Connor is too pathetic to satisfy me anyway, and he is far too stupid to ever demand a paternity test. The sheer arrogance of her confession was breathtaking. I smiled up at her, secure in the knowledge that I had just captured the complete destruction of their entire family dynamic on crisp, high-definition digital audio. I thanked her politely for stopping by my table and watched her strut back to Catherine, completely unaware that she had just handed me the final key to their total annihilation. She had sealed her own fate with her profound vanity. While I was calmly drinking my sparkling water at the country club dining room, completely dismantling their future, Connor was executing a desperate and highly illegal plan of his own. He was absolutely terrified of the federal lock I had placed on the corporate accounts. He knew that if the government auditors uncovered the backup hard drives I had hidden, he and his father would face decades in a federal penitentiary. Relying on his family wealth and arrogance, he bribed a junior housekeeping staff member at my hotel to let him into my private suite. Connor tore through my room like a wild animal. He ripped the mattress off the bed, emptied my luggage onto the floor, and completely ransacked the closet, searching frantically for the encrypted digital drives holding the Montgomery firm's fraudulent ledgers. He was sweating heavily, his heart pounding in his chest, as he tore apart my personal sanctuary. He ripped the linings out of my suitcases and shattered a hotel lamp in his blind panic. But he did not find the hard drives because I had already securely locked them in a private federal vault days ago. Instead, his tearing apart of the room led him to the small wooden desk in the corner. I had purposefully left a single manila folder sitting right out in the open waiting for him. Connor snatched the folder, believing he had found the financial evidence. He ripped it open and his eyes scanned the printed pages inside. It was not a financial ledger or a list of offshore bank accounts. It was a certified medical DNA requisition form from a highly respected genetic testing facility. I had quietly acquired the samples months ago, when my suspicions about his family's twisted dynamics first began to grow. Connor read the conclusive results printed in bold black ink at the bottom of the final page. The document proved with absolute scientific certainty that Harrison Montgomery, the man who had tormented him, bullied him, and demanded a pure bloodline, his entire life was not his biological father. The bloodline obsession that drove their entire toxic family culture was a complete fabrication manufactured by his deceitful mother decades ago. Connor dropped the paper onto the desk, his hands shaking violently as his entire reality completely shattered into a million pieces. He fell to his knees in the middle of my destroyed hotel room, sobbing uncontrollably as the monumental weight of his mother's lifelong betrayal crashed down upon him. He finally understood that he was not a Montgomery heir. He was just a pawn in a very sick game, and his entire existence had been built on a devastating lie. Connor stayed on the floor of my ruined hotel room for what felt like hours. The revelation that he did not share a single drop of Montgomery blood tore through him like a Category 5 hurricane. His entire life, his arrogant entitlement, his convenient excuse for treating me poorly, had all been justified by his supposedly superior genetics. Now he was nothing but the product of his mother's infidelity. He stumbled out of the hotel, his hands shaking so violently he could barely start his expensive sports car. He drove recklessly through the city, heading straight back to his parents' sprawling estate. He did not bother knocking or greeting the household staff. He barged violently into the private sunroom, where Catherine was peacefully sipping her afternoon tea and flipping through a high society magazine. He threw the crumpled DNA requisition form directly into her lap. The porcelain teacup shattered on the marble floor as she read the paper. Catherine turned ashen. Her manicured hands flew to her mouth and she frantically looked around the room to ensure Harrison was not within earshot. Connor demanded the truth, his voice shaking with a terrifying mix of profound betrayal and blinding rage. For 35 years, she had fed him lies. She confessed, sobbing uncontrollably and begging him to keep his voice down. She admitted she had a brief, reckless affair with a local tennis instructor the summer before her lavish wedding to Harrison. She knew Harrison would never accept her if she arrived pregnant by another man, let alone a working-class employee with zero social standing. So she trapped him. She let Harrison build his massive empire, believing Connor was his ultimate legacy. The sacred, pure bloodline they loved to brag about at their country club dinners was a total, absolute sham. Intense paranoia instantly set in between mother and son. Connor realized that if Harrison ever found out the truth, they would both be thrown out onto the street with absolutely nothing to their names. Catherine realized her golden child now held the ultimate power to destroy her comfortable, luxurious life. Their villainous alliance fractured, immediately replaced by a toxic, fearful standoff. They were trapped together in a suffocating web of their own making, terrified of each other and utterly terrified of the man who controlled their dwindling finances. Meanwhile, Harrison was entirely consumed by his own impending doom. The federal lock I had placed on his corporate banking network was squeezing him dry. He was bleeding cash at an unprecedented, catastrophic rate. His loyal contractors were walking off active construction sites because their weekly checks were bouncing. His prominent club friends, sensing the sudden weakness, were refusing to take his calls. The impending federal forensic audit terrified him more than anything else in the world. He knew exactly what was buried deep within those corporate servers. He knew that the moment my colleagues gained full administrative access to his system, he would be indicted for decades of massive corporate fraud, tax evasion, and racketeering. Desperation makes arrogant men incredibly reckless. Harrison decided he could not wait for the corrupt political strings he pulled to save him. He needed untraceable cash, and he needed it immediately to survive. He hatched a desperate, highly illegal maneuver to liquidate the family's commercial real estate portfolio. He reached out to his darkest, most dangerous underground contacts. He bypassed the traditional, highly regulated legal avenues and set up a secret, closed-door board meeting with a group of shady foreign investors. He offered to sell them his prime downtown buildings for absolute pennies on the dollar. He demanded the payment be made entirely in untraceable cryptocurrency and rapid offshore wire transfers to unflagged anonymous accounts in the Cayman Islands. His plan was brutally simple and entirely selfish. He intended to take the massive payout, abandon his failing company, abandon his fake heir, abandon his deceitful wife, and flee the country on a private jet before the federal agents could officially issue an arrest warrant. He thought he was moving completely under the radar. He thought that pulling strings to deactivate my security badge had rendered me blind silent and entirely powerless to stop him. Harrison severely miscalculated the situation. Being placed on administrative leave was the absolute greatest gift he could have ever given me. When you carry a federal badge, you are bound by strict ethical protocols, lengthy approval processes, and endless layers of frustrating bureaucratic red tape. You have to play by the rules and wait for the proper authorizations. But right now, thanks to his political interference, I was officially off the clock. I was operating entirely outside federal restrictions, which meant I could finally take the gloves off and fight dirty. I partnered up with Jasmine. As a high-powered, brilliantly ruthless corporate attorney, Jasmine had unparalleled access to every real estate registry, corporate filing, and shadow company operating in the state. She did not need a federal warrant to track Harrison's desperate, clumsy real estate movements. She just needed her brilliant legal mind and a highly secure internet connection. We set up a makeshift command center in her downtown corner office, fueled by black coffee and sheer determination. Within 24 hours, Jasmine intercepted digital communications confirming the secret fireside sale. She identified the specific shell-holding company Harrison was trying to use to bypass the federal lock on his primary assets. We knew exactly when and where the secret board meeting was taking place. We also knew exactly what Harrison was trying to sell to these mysterious men. The foreign investors thought they were getting the absolute steal of the century on premium commercial real estate. But I had the true UN-doctored financial ledgers saved on my encrypted backup drives. I knew those specific buildings were structurally condemned, environmentally compromised, and riddled with millions of dollars in toxic debt and severe code violations. Harrison was not just fleeing his crumbling empire. He was actively committing one final, massive act of wire fraud against these foreign buyers to fund his luxurious escape. We printed every single page of the true ledgers. We highlighted the fraudulent appraisals, the hidden debt, and the falsified safety inspection reports. We packed the heavy documents into Jasmine's sleek leather briefcases. We were not going to stop the meeting from happening. We were going to let Harrison dig his own grave right in front of the people he was trying to cheat. Jasmine and I arrived at the Montgomery corporate headquarters precisely at the time the meeting was scheduled to conclude. The panicked receptionist tried to physically stop us from passing the front desk, but Jasmine simply flashed a brilliant predatory smile, threatened her with a massive harassment lawsuit, and walked right past her. We took the private executive elevator directly to the top floor. We did not knock. Jasmine pushed open the heavy mahogany doors of the executive boardroom with enough force to make them hit the walls. Inside, Harrison was sitting at the head of a massive custom glass table. Connor was sitting next to him, looking physically ill, his hands shaking as he sweated profusely in his expensive suit. Across from them sat three men in sharp, dark-tailored suits, the wealthy foreign investors. Stacks of highly illegal sale contracts were spread across the glass surface. Harrison looked up, his face immediately turning an angry, vibrant shade of purple when he saw me standing triumphantly in the doorway. He let out a loud, condescending laugh, immediately trying to control the narrative in the room. "Gentlemen, please excuse this minor interruption," Harrison said, waving his hand at me dismissively. "This is just my son's disgruntled ex-wife. She is currently having a rather pathetic mental breakdown because she is extremely bitter about our family's enormous success. Building security will escort her out momentarily." He reached for his gold fountain pen, eager to finalize the fraudulent sale and secure his escape funds. I did not say a single word in response to his insults. I walked straight up to the center of the glass table. I opened my briefcase and dropped the true UN-doctored financial ledgers directly on top of his fake contracts. The heavy stack of papers hit the glass with a loud, satisfying thud that echoed in the quiet room. "I strongly suggest you read those before you sign anything," I said, looking directly at the lead investor. "The buildings you are buying today are completely condemned. They are structurally failing and riddled with millions in toxic hidden debt. You are not buying a prestigious real estate empire. You are buying an active federal crime scene." Harrison stood up his heavy chair, scraping violently against the hardwood floor. He began screaming that I was clinically insane, demanding the men ignore my fabrications. But the lead foreign investor did not look angry. He did not look surprised or offended. He slowly closed his expensive leather portfolio. He stood up from his chair, reached inside his tailored suit jacket, and pulled out a gleaming silver badge. He held it up high for Harrison to see clearly. A slow, triumphant smile spread across the man's face as he looked at my former father-in-law. He was not a foreign investor at all. He was an undercover federal agent. The federal agent's silver badge gleamed under the harsh fluorescent lights of the boardroom. The air in the room instantly grew heavy and suffocating. Harrison stumbled backward, his expensive leather chair tipping over and crashing onto the floor. The smug, condescending laugh he had worn just seconds prior completely vanished, replaced by the pale, clammy look of a man who realized his entire empire had just collapsed. The other two foreign investors calmly reached into their tailored jackets, producing matching federal badges and standing shoulder to shoulder with their lead agent. Jasmine stood beside me, her arms crossed, radiating absolute professional triumph. We watched as the agents methodically began reading Harrison his rights, explicitly outlining the massive scale of the wire fraud and international racketeering they had just caught him attempting to execute. But Harrison Montgomery was a survivor, a rat who always knew exactly which sinking ship to abandon. Sweating profusely and trembling violently, he immediately launched into a frantic, pathetic defense. He pointed a shaking finger at his own chief financial officer, a loyal man who had worked for the Montgomery family for over 20 years. Harrison screamed that he had absolutely no knowledge of the toxic debt or the falsified safety inspection reports. He claimed his CFO had gone rogue, manipulating the ledgers and orchestrating the entire illegal sale behind his back. The betrayal was instantaneous and absolutely ruthless. The federal agents, bound by strict legal protocols regarding immediate burden of proof, were forced to detain the CFO on the spot, while Harrison narrowly avoided leaving the building in handcuffs. He was permitted to walk out of his own corporate headquarters, but his firm was completely decimated. Federal investigators swarmed the building within the hour, seizing servers, locking down filing cabinets, and officially turning the Montgomery real estate empire into a massive active crime scene. The immediate financial fallout hit the rest of the family like a freight train. Catherine and Ashley, entirely oblivious to the federal raid happening downtown, were busy attempting to maintain their lavish lifestyle. They were strutting through the most exclusive luxury boutiques in the city's high-end shopping district. Catherine had decided that Ashley needed a completely new maternity wardrobe to properly showcase the fake Montgomery air. They piled thousands of dollars worth of designer clothing, cashmere blankets, and imported leather bags onto the glass checkout counter of a high-end boutique. Catherine handed her heavy metal black card to the sales associate with a haughty, dismissive flick of her wrist. The associate swiped the card. The machine beeped a loud, harsh rejection. Catherine scoffed, blaming a faulty machine, and pulled out a different platinum card. Declined again. Ashley, growing annoyed, slapped her own Montgomery-issued credit card onto the counter. Declined. The sales associate looked at them with a mixture of pity and barely concealed amusement. Other wealthy patrons in the boutique stopped pretending to browse and openly stared at the two women. Catherine's face turned a violent shade of crimson. Her entire social standing was built on the illusion of infinite wealth, and now she was standing in front of her high society peers, entirely unable to purchase a single item. The federal lock I had initiated was absolute. Every joint account, every corporate card, and every hidden slush fund tied to the Montgomery name was entirely frozen. They were completely and utterly broke, and the public humiliation was only just beginning. Harrison returned to his sprawling mansion completely unhinged. He was a cornered animal, bleeding cash, terrified of the impending audit, and desperate to regain some semblance of control. He knew he could not touch me directly. I was surrounded by federal protection, legally represented by Jasmine, and operating entirely outside his sphere of influence. Because he could not reach me, his cowardly mind sought out the easiest, most vulnerable target he could find. He decided to go after my father. My father was a retired public school teacher who lived a quiet, peaceful life in a modest single-story retirement home on the outskirts of the city. He spent his days tending to his small vegetable garden and reading historical biographies on his front porch. After my mother passed away 10 years ago, that little house became his entire world. It was his sanctuary, and Harrison knew exactly how much that home meant to both of us. Years ago, the Montgomery firm had purchased the large tract of land surrounding my father's neighborhood. Harrison had always loved to casually remind me that a subsidiary of his corporate empire technically owned the deed to my father's property, holding it over my head like a silent, lingering threat throughout my marriage to Connor. Seeking petty, malicious revenge for the humiliation in the boardroom, Harrison dispatched 3 of his most aggressive property enforcers. These were not standard administrative clerks. They were large, intimidating men in cheap suits hired specifically to frighten tenants and execute ruthless immediate evictions. Harrison ordered them to drive to my father's house, throw his modest belongings onto the front lawn, and physically remove an elderly man from his home under the guise of an emergency corporate foreclosure. He wanted to break my spirit by hurting the only family I had left. He wanted me to feel the same devastating loss of control that he was currently experiencing. He severely underestimated my foresight. I had recognized the danger Harrison posed years ago. When I first began working as a forensic auditor and started noticing the glaring discrepancies in the Montgomery financial ledgers, I knew their entire operation was unstable. I knew that leaving my father's housing security in Harrison's corrupt hands was a massive liability. I did not wait for the axe to fall. 3 years ago, I meticulously tracked the ownership structure of the subsidiary company that held my father's deed. Operating with total secrecy, I established an anonymous limited liability company and legally purchased the property outright. I paid the market value in full, severing all ties to the Montgomery Empire. Harrison had absolutely no idea. His bloated, disorganized firm was so poorly managed and riddled with fake shell companies that his accounting department never even registered the legitimate sale of one small retirement property. I received a frantic phone call from my father just as the black SUV pulled up to his curb. He was confused and frightened, telling me that 3 aggressive men were pounding on his front door, demanding he vacate the premises immediately. I told him to lock the door, make a cup of tea, and absolutely not open it for anyone but me. Jasmine and I were already in her car speeding toward his neighborhood. We arrived at the property line just as the 3 enforcers were unloading heavy cardboard boxes from their vehicle, preparing to physically clear out my father's home. The lead enforcer, a burly man with a thick neck and a permanent scowl, marched toward my father's front porch, waving a stack of official-looking Montgomery corporate eviction papers. I stepped out of Jasmine's car and walked directly into his path, blocking him from reaching the front steps. I did not raise my voice. I did not show an ounce of fear or panic. I simply stood my ground, staring him down with the cold, calculated precision of a federal investigator. "You need to step aside, lady," the lead enforcer growled, trying to physically intimidate me by stepping uncomfortably close. "This property is owned by Montgomery Holdings, and we have direct orders from Harrison Montgomery to clear this house immediately. The tenant is officially evicted." I looked at the cheap, falsified eviction notice in his hand and offered a calm, condescending smile. I reached into my leather tote bag and pulled out a crisp, heavy, legally notarized document. I did not argue with him. I simply pressed the thick paper directly against his chest, forcing him to take it. "You might want to call your boss and tell him his accounting department is about 3 years behind on their paperwork," I said, my voice steady and commanding. "Montgomery Holdings does not own this property. They have not owned it for a very long time." The enforcer frowned, his aggressive demeanor faltering as he looked down at the document. It was the original certified property deed. He traced his thick finger over the legal text, reading the clear, undeniable proof that the property belonged entirely to my anonymous LLC. He flipped to the second page, verifying the official city and state seals. The realization slowly dawned on him that Harrison had sent him to execute an illegal eviction on a property the Montgomery family had absolutely zero legal right to touch. If he proceeded up those porch steps, he would be committing felony trespassing and breaking and entering. Harrison Montgomery owns absolutely nothing here, I stated, stepping even closer to ensure he understood the gravity of the situation. And if you or your men take one more step toward my father's house, my attorney standing right behind me will have you arrested for criminal trespassing and harassment. The three men exchanged nervous, uncertain glances. They were hired muscle paid to intimidate vulnerable tenants, not to engage in highly illegal confrontations with federal auditors and corporate lawyers. The lead enforcer swallowed hard, hastily folding the fake eviction notice and shoving it into his jacket pocket. He muttered a quick, embarrassed apology and signaled for his men to pack up the empty cardboard boxes. They had been completely neutralized without a single raised voice. But I was not quite finished with them. As the lead enforcer turned to walk back to his SUV, I called out his name. He stopped looking back at me with apprehension. I reached into my bag one final time and pulled out a second, significantly thicker legal envelope. Since you are heading back to report your absolute failure to Harrison, I have a delivery I need you to make on my behalf, I said, walking toward him and extending the envelope. The man looked at the envelope as if it were a live explosive. What is it? He asked cautiously. During my extensive review of Harrison's completely chaotic financial portfolio, I noticed he had severely overleveraged his prized luxury summer estate, I explained smoothly. He took out massive high-interest loans against the property to fund his illegal operations, assuming his fake wealth would always cover the margins. When his accounts froze this week, those loans defaulted instantly. I smiled, letting the absolute devastation of my next words sink in. Because I am officially on administrative leave, I had a lot of free time on my hands. I reached out to the private creditors holding that toxic debt. I legally purchased the outstanding note on his vacation home this morning. I now completely own the debt on Harrison Montgomery's favorite summer estate. I pushed the envelope directly into the enforcer's hands. He gripped it tightly, his eyes wide with shock as he realized exactly what I had done. That envelope contains a formal, legally binding counter-eviction notice, I told him, my tone shifting to pure ice. Deliver it directly to Harrison. Tell him his new landlord is calling in the debt. He has exactly 24 hours to pack up his golf clubs and completely vacate his own vacation home before I send the local sheriff to physically throw him out onto the street. Ashley had never known the metallic rejection tone of a credit card machine until this week. The humiliation at the luxury boutique burned through her veins like acid. She had stormed out of the store empty-handed, leaving Catherine behind to deal with the staring socialites. When Ashley returned to the Montgomery estate, the atmosphere was unrecognizable. The usually pristine mansion felt like a tomb. The household staff had quietly abandoned their posts after their latest paychecks failed to clear. Connor was locked inside the master bedroom, Day drinking in the dark, completely non-responsive to her demands for an explanation. Catherine was barricaded in the parlor, weeping into her phone while her high society friends conveniently ignored her calls. The illusion of the untouchable Montgomery empire was rapidly disintegrating right before Ashley's eyes. She was a woman who survived entirely on calculated opportunism, and her survival instincts were screaming that the ship was taking on water fast. She realized with a sudden, suffocating terror that the $2 million trust fund Harrison had promised for her unborn child was a total fabrication. There was no trust fund. There was no fortune. There was only debt lies and impending federal indictments. Ashley did not panic. She pivoted. She marched directly to Harrison's private study, kicking the heavy oak doors open without knocking. Harrison was hunched over his massive desk, surrounded by stacks of past due notices and legal threats. His face was a sickly shade of gray, and he looked as though he had aged 20 years in a single week. He glared at her, demanding she leave his office immediately. Ashley simply laughed, a cold, sharp sound that echoed in the cavernous room. She walked over to his liquor cabinet, poured herself a glass of his most expensive scotch, and took a slow, deliberate sip despite her pregnancy. She looked at him with absolute contempt. She told him the charade was over. She knew the corporate accounts were frozen by the federal government. She knew the construction sites were shut down. Most importantly, she told him she knew exactly why Connor was currently crying on the floor of their bedroom. She revealed that she knew Connor was not a Montgomery by blood, and that the precious family legacy was a complete joke. Harrison's jaw dropped. The color drained completely from his face as Ashley calmly laid out her extortion demands. She explained that she had no intention of sticking around to play the supportive wife, while his corrupt empire collapsed into a federal prison sentence. She also had no intention of leaving empty-handed. She demanded $500,000 in untraceable cash wired directly to her personal independent banking account by the end of the business day. If he failed to deliver the money, she promised to walk straight down to the local news stations and the country club gossip columnists. She threatened to expose everything. She would tell the world that the Montgomery family was completely bankrupt. She would tell them that Catherine had been lying about Connor's paternity for 35 years. And she would reveal that the highly anticipated Montgomery heir currently growing in her stomach actually belonged to a local fitness trainer, making a mockery of Harrison's obsession with pure genetics. She promised to turn his name into a permanent, humiliating punchline across the entire state. Harrison was cornered. He was already facing federal prison for massive corporate fraud, but the thought of profound public humiliation in his elite social circles terrified him even more. He could not bear the thought of his wealthy peers laughing at him for raising another man's child and being swindled by a gold-digging opportunist. He needed to buy her silence just long enough for him to finalize his own escape plan. He agreed to her terms. Harrison possessed one final deeply buried offshore account located in the Cayman Islands. It was his ultimate rainy day fund, completely unregistered and entirely hidden from domestic tax authorities and federal regulators. He had been saving it for a moment, exactly like this. With shaking hands, he picked up his encrypted satellite phone and contacted his offshore banker. He authorized the immediate liquidation of $500,000 to be wired directly into Ashley's private domestic account. He instructed the banker to bypass the standard holding periods and execute the transfer immediately, regardless of the exorbitant transaction fees. He thought he was buying his salvation. He genuinely believed that paying off his fake daughter-in-law would temporarily plug the leak and allow him to slip quietly out of the country before the federal auditors knocked down his front door. He was profoundly mistaken. While I was technically stripped of my auditing authority and placed on administrative leave, my digital traps were still very much alive. Before my supervisor confiscated my federal laptop and deactivated my security badge, I had legally established a series of automated monitoring algorithms across the entire Montgomery financial network. These algorithms were designed to flag any suspicious movement of capital and send automated alerts directly to my secure personal portal. I was sitting at the glass dining table in Jasmine's luxury apartment, reviewing the eviction countermeasures when my encrypted smartphone vibrated. A high-priority alert flashed across the screen. I opened the notification and watched the digital footprint of Harrison's desperation play out in real time. A massive wire transfer originating from a flagged tax haven jurisdiction was actively attempting to deposit $500,000 into a domestic account tied to the Montgomery web. The receiving account belonged exclusively to Ashley. I stared at the screen, a slow, satisfied smile spreading across my face. Harrison's sheer arrogance and panic had caused him to make a fatal, catastrophic error. By utilizing an undeclared offshore account to transfer a massive sum of money into a domestic banking network that was currently under a hard federal freeze for suspected corporate fraud, he had crossed a massive legal line. He had not just moved money. He had triggered an automatic international money laundering protocol. Because the domestic account was already flagged by the Treasury Department, any incoming foreign capital automatically became classified as illicit funds, attempting to be cleaned through the American banking system. Ashley was unknowingly acting as the final recipient of heavily laundered criminal assets. I did not need my active federal badge to intervene. As a sworn financial officer, I am legally bound by a strict code of ethics that mandates the immediate reporting of active international money laundering, regardless of my current employment status. Operating entirely within the bounds of the law, I logged into the public portal for the Financial Crimes Enforcement Network. I submitted the exact routing numbers, the offshore origination details, and the destination account information. I filed a highly detailed suspicious activity report classifying the $500,000 wire transfer as active international money laundering linked to an ongoing federal racketeering investigation. The response from the federal banking authorities was instantaneous and completely automated. The moment Ashley's bank received the wire transfer, the funds were immediately seized and placed into a permanent federal holding vault. The money never actually hit her available balance, but the digital record of her receiving the illicit funds was permanently cemented in the banking registry. Ashley was completely oblivious to the digital warfare occurring behind the scenes. She woke up the next morning feeling absolutely triumphant. She dressed in her most expensive designer outfit, grabbed her luxury handbag, and called a private car service to take her to the premier downtown branch of her bank. She strutted through the heavy revolving doors of the financial institution, projecting the aura of a wealthy, untouchable socialite. She bypassed the regular teller line and demanded to speak directly with the branch manager. She wanted a certified cashier's check for the full $500,000 immediately so she could secure a luxury apartment in a different state and disappear before the Montgomery family officially imploded. She sat in the plush leather chair in the branch manager's glass-walled office, crossing her legs and checking her flawless manicure while he pulled up her account information on his computer monitor. She expected him to grovel and apologize for the slight delay. Instead, she watched the blood completely drain from the manager's face. He stared at his monitor, his eyes widening in absolute horror as a flashing red federal seizure notice locked his entire computer system. The manager stammered nervously, telling Ashley there was a slight irregularity with the international wire transfer and that he needed to make a quick phone call to the corporate compliance department. He hastily excused himself from the office, leaving Ashley rolling her eyes in deep annoyance at the sheer incompetence of the banking staff. She waited for exactly 10 minutes, her irritation growing with every passing second. She finally stood up, grabbing her designer bag, fully intending to march out to the lobby and demand better service. As she reached for the brass handle of the office door, it suddenly swung open from the outside. The branch manager did not return. Instead, two large, intimidating men wearing tactical vests and dark windbreakers stepped into the small office. The bold yellow letters emblazoned across their chests clearly identified them as federal agents working for the Financial Crimes Division. Ashley froze, her arrogant smirk completely vanishing, as the lead agent firmly instructed her to place her hands on the desk. He calmly informed her that she was being officially detained for questioning regarding her direct involvement in a massive international money laundering syndicate linked to the Montgomery corporate empire. Ashley began screaming hysterically, demanding they call Harrison, demanding they check her pristine social records, and swearing she was just a victim. The federal agents ignored her protests entirely, snapping cold metal handcuffs around her wrists right there in the bank manager's office, leaving her completely penniless, facing severe federal indictments, and realizing too late that her extortion attempt had perfectly sealed her own destruction. Ashley's dramatic arrest at the downtown bank branch sent shockwaves through the financial district, but Catherine remained completely oblivious to her fake daughter-in-law's federal detention. Catherine was too busy waging a desperate war on a completely different front. With Harrison's real estate empire facing imminent federal collapse and his reputation hanging by a thread, she needed a convenient scapegoat to distract the elite social circles. She needed everyone to look away from the Montgomery family's rapidly deteriorating finances and focus entirely on my supposed instability. She picked up her phone and called the editor of the city's most vicious high society tabloid. The next morning, a highly sensationalized article hit the newsstands and flooded social media feeds across the state. The headline was printed in bold red letters, accusing me of a total psychological breakdown. The article claimed my recent administrative suspension from the Federal Auditing Bureau was the tragic result of severe mental instability directly caused by my failure to conceive a child. Catherine provided exclusive anonymous quotes portraying herself as a long-suffering, deeply supportive mother-in-law who had tried everything to help her deeply flawed, barren daughter-in-law. She wove a sickeningly detailed narrative about my supposed erratic behavior, claiming I was stalking her family and utilizing government resources to exact petty revenge because I was physically incapable of giving Connor an heir. She weaponized the most painful, agonizing years of my life to buy her family a few more days of social sympathy. She thought bringing my infertility into the public spotlight would humiliate me into total submission and force me to hide in shame. She fundamentally failed to understand that a woman who has already lost everything has absolutely nothing left to fear. I sat in Jasmine's office reading the pathetic tabloid article while drinking a cup of black coffee. I did not shed a single tear. I did not feel a shred of embarrassment. I felt a cold, sharp surge of pure adrenaline. Catherine wanted to talk about my medical history in a public forum. I was more than happy to oblige her, but I prefer to deal in verifiable facts rather than fabricated gossip. I looked across the desk at Jasmine and gave her a simple nod. Jasmine immediately drafted an emergency legal subpoena. We did not just request my basic medical charts from the exclusive Boston fertility clinic. Jasmine filed a massive comprehensive discovery motion demanding every single internal communication financial ledger and archived security recording associated with the Montgomery family's account at that specific medical facility. Because Catherine had publicly discussed my private medical details in the tabloid, she had inadvertently waived the very privacy protections she relied upon to hide her own secrets. The clinic, terrified of being dragged into a highly publicized federal racketeering investigation, complied with the subpoena with astonishing speed. 2 days later, a massive digital file arrived in Jasmine's secure inbox. We spent hours meticulously combing through the data. We found the altered charts and the falsified lab reports. But the most devastating piece of evidence was buried deep within the clinic's internal compliance archives. It was a digital audio recording of a private consultation that took place exactly 3 years ago. I pressed play on my laptop, and Catherine's unmistakable, arrogant voice filled the quiet office. The recording captured a closed-door meeting between Catherine and the clinic's lead fertility specialist. The doctor was attempting to explain Connor's absolute zero sperm count. He was outlining treatment options when Catherine abruptly cut him off. Her voice dripped with elitist contempt. Connor cannot be the problem, she stated firmly. The Montgomery heir cannot be defective. You will alter these charts immediately. You will blame her average middle-class genetics. You will tell Melanie her egg reserves are completely depleted, and her body is simply rejecting the process. If you protect my son's pride and keep his name off these failure reports, I will personally ensure that your new pediatric wing receives a multi-million-dollar anonymous donation by the end of the fiscal quarter. The audio continued capturing the sickening sound of a medical professional selling his soul to protect a fragile male ego. The doctor agreed to falsify my medical records. He agreed to subject me to years of grueling, unnecessary hormone injections and devastating emotional trauma simply to maintain the illusion of Connor's perfect Montgomery bloodline. Catherine had bought my suffering with a promised donation just so her son would never have to feel inadequate. I did not take this evidence to a courtroom. A lawsuit would take years, and Catherine would use her remaining social influence to delay the proceedings endlessly. I wanted immediate, undeniable destruction. I wanted her to feel the exact same public humiliation she had just tried to inflict upon me. I created an untraceable anonymous email address. I attached the raw, unedited audio file along with the corresponding falsified medical charts. I sent the package directly to every major investigative journalist in the city. I also sent it to the inbox of every single prominent board member at the Oak Ridge Country Club. The release was catastrophic. The audio file spread across the internet like wildfire. The local news stations picked up the story within hours, running the recording on loop during their evening broadcasts. The public backlash was immediate and intensely vicious. The narrative Catherine had tried to spin in the tabloid completely collapsed. She was no longer the tragic, supportive mother-in-law. She was a monster who had bribed a medical professional to mentally and physically torture another woman. The state medical board announced an emergency investigation into the fertility clinic, promising to revoke the lead doctor's medical license. Catherine was sitting in her lavish parlor, completely unaware of the digital bomb that had just detonated. She was waiting for her high society friends to call and offer their sympathies regarding the tabloid article. Instead, her phone rang with a call from the president of the Oak Ridge Country Club. The conversation was incredibly brief and absolutely brutal. The club president informed Catherine that the board of directors had held an emergency vote. Her lifetime family membership was officially revoked, effective immediately. He cited a strict zero-tolerance policy for moral turpitude and public disgrace. He coldly demanded that she never set foot on the club property again, stating that her presence was a toxic embarrassment to their prestigious institution. Catherine dropped her phone onto the plush carpet. Her entire world, her social standing, her reputation, and her elite community had just been completely obliterated in a matter of minutes. The ladies who lunched with her would now cross the street to avoid her. She was a total pariah. Panic set in. She desperately needed comfort. She needed someone to validate her and tell her that they would survive this scandal together. She wiped her mascara-stained eyes and ran up the grand, sweeping staircase of the mansion, heading straight for Connor's bedroom. She expected to find her golden boy ready to defend her honor against my relentless attacks. She threw open the heavy bedroom door, but the words of comfort died in her throat. Connor was not waiting to console her. He was standing in the middle of the room, frantically throwing designer suits and expensive shoes into a large leather suitcase. His face was pale, his eyes bloodshot from days of heavy drinking and intense stress. The room was completely trashed, reflecting the absolute chaos inside his mind. Catherine stepped forward, reaching out her hands. "Connor, darling, what are you doing? We need to stand together right now," she pleaded, her voice trembling with genuine fear. Connor slowly turned around to face her. The look in his eyes was not love or loyalty. It was pure, unadulterated hatred. He reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out the crumpled piece of paper he had stolen from my hotel room days ago. It was the certified DNA requisition form. He held it up, shaking it violently in her face. "You want to stand together," he screamed, his voice cracking with rage. "You want to protect the precious Montgomery family name." "There is no Montgomery family. You lied to me my entire life. You let me believe I was a failure. You let me believe I was inadequate while you bribed doctors to torture my wife. And you did it all to protect a bloodline that does not even exist." He threw the DNA results directly at her chest. "I know about the tennis instructor, Mother. I know I am just a bastard you used to trap Harrison into paying for your luxury lifestyle." Catherine stumbled backward as if she had been physically struck. She hit the doorframe, sliding down onto the floor as her legs completely gave out. She covered her face with her hands, sobbing hysterically and begging him to understand that she did it all for his benefit. But Connor was completely done listening to her toxic lies. He zipped up his suitcase with violent force, dragging it over the hardwood floor. He marched out of the grand estate, forever leaving Catherine completely alone in the echoing marble hallway, her relationship with her only son entirely and permanently shattered beyond repair. The Montgomery estate was a smoldering crater of shattered egos and exposed lies, but Harrison Montgomery possessed the terrifying resilience of a true psychopath. He did not care that his wife was catatonic on the parlor floor. He did not care that his supposed heir had packed his bags and abandoned the family legacy. Harrison only cared about one thing: his own survival. With federal indictments looming and his domestic accounts locked in a permanent federal freeze, he was a cornered predator desperately searching for an escape route. His final pathetic grasp at power was the annual Montgomery Winter Charity Gala. For decades, this event had been the crown jewel of the city's high society calendar. It was ostensibly a glamorous fundraiser for underprivileged children, but in reality, it was a massive, unregulated slush fund. Harrison intended to use the gala as a final grift. He planned to collect millions of dollars in untraceable cash and offshore wire transfers from the city's elite disguised as charitable donations. He needed that capital to hire a team of ruthless defense attorneys and charter a private flight to a non-extradition country before the federal prosecutors could file official flight risk restrictions against him. Harrison knew I was the singular threat to his desperate exit strategy. He knew I understood the mechanics of his financial crimes better than his own accounting department. Paranoia consumed him entirely. He converted the historic Sterling Conservatory, the lavish venue hosting the gala, into an absolute fortress. He liquidated his last remaining physical asset, a collection of vintage sports cars, just to hire an elite privately armed security firm. These were not standard event bouncers. They were highly trained tactical contractors with strict, explicit orders to secure the perimeter against two specific targets. Harrison personally handed high-resolution photographs of Jasmine and me to the head of security. He stood in the grand foyer of the conservatory, his eyes bloodshot and manic, screaming at the guards that under no circumstances were we to be allowed on the premises. He ordered them to use physical force if necessary, authorizing them to arrest us for trespassing the moment we stepped onto the sidewalk. He genuinely believed that a wall of armed men and a reinforced guest list would be enough to keep me out. He thought he could simply lock the doors and hide behind his hired muscle while he robbed his wealthy peers blind. He completely failed to grasp how far ahead of him I was already operating. I had absolutely no intention of showing up at the front doors of the Sterling Conservatory in an evening gown to argue with a wall of hired security guards. Trying to sneak into a party was beneath me. I did not want to crash his event. I wanted to systematically dismantle the ground he was standing on. While Harrison was busy barking orders at his security detail and arranging crystal champagne flutes, Jasmine and I were sitting in a sleek, glass-walled boardroom on the top floor of the city's most prestigious commercial real estate firm. We were not dealing with party planners or caterers. We were meeting directly with the executive board of the Sterling Heritage Trust, the actual legal owners of the conservatory building. The Sterling Heritage Trust was an old conservative organization that despised scandal and strictly valued financial stability. They had leased the historic venue to the Montgomery firm for the past 20 years, based on the illusion of Harrison's impeccable credit. They were entirely unaware of the federal raid on the Montgomery headquarters or the total freeze on Harrison's corporate accounts. I sat at the head of the boardroom table, opened my leather briefcase, and laid out a stack of heavily redacted, verified financial documents. I did not waste their time with pleasantries. I presented the executive board with undeniable mathematical proof that Harrison Montgomery was completely bankrupt. I showed them the frozen routing numbers, the defaulted construction loans, and the impending federal racketeering charges. The board members stared at the documents in absolute horror. Their prestigious historic property was currently being utilized as the staging ground for a massive illegal grift orchestrated by a man facing imminent federal imprisonment. But I was not simply there to be a whistleblower. I was there to execute a flawless, hostile corporate maneuver. During my extensive forensic review of Harrison's shadow ledgers, I had discovered a massive vulnerability in his contract with the Sterling Heritage Trust. Harrison had structured the venue lease through one of his many fraudulent shell companies, utilizing falsified collateral to secure the long-term agreement. Furthermore, because his accounts were locked, the massive deposit required to finalize the booking for that evening's gala had bounced exactly 48 hours ago. Technically and legally, Harrison was already in default. He was currently trespassing in their building. I watched the realization spread across the faces of the board members as Jasmine smoothly slid a new, incredibly lucrative contract across the polished mahogany table. I was not asking them to cancel Harrison's event. I was offering to purchase the master lease and assume total operational control of the Sterling Conservatory's holding company, effective immediately. I used the clean, highly liquid capital I had secured through my own anonymous limited liability company, the same corporate entity I had used to buy my father's property out from under Harrison. I offered the board a massive premium fully paid in certified funds to transfer the property deed and the holding rights directly into my name. In exchange, they would instantly rid themselves of the toxic radioactive liability that was Harrison Montgomery. The board did not even need to deliberate. Faced with the immediate threat of being named as co-conspirators in a federal money laundering investigation by hosting a fraudulent charity event, they signed the paperwork without hesitation. The transfer of power was seamless, brutal, and entirely legal. By 3 o'clock in the afternoon, the ink was dry. The certified funds cleared the banking wire. The city clerk's office processed the emergency digital transfer. Jasmine stamped the final page with her notary seal, offering me a sharp, victorious smile. I packed the legally binding deed into my briefcase. I had just executed a hostile takeover of the venue's holding company in less than 3 hours. Back at the Sterling Conservatory, Harrison was living in a state of manic delusion. The sun began to set, casting long shadows across the manicured lawns. The string quartet was tuning their instruments in the grand ballroom. The catering staff was carrying silver trays of expensive hors d'oeuvres. The tactical security team stood at absolute attention by the heavy iron gates, carefully scrutinizing every single guest who arrived. Harrison stood at the top of the marble staircase wearing a bespoke tuxedo, adjusting his silk bow tie. He watched the city's elite begin to file into the building, their checkbooks ready, completely unaware that they were walking into a federal trap. He felt a surge of arrogant triumph. He had done it. He had locked his enemies out. He was going to collect his millions, and he was going to vanish into the night like a ghost. He was so incredibly wrong. He thought he was the master of his domain, completely blind to the fact that the domain no longer belonged to him. As the first 100 guests mingled in the foyer, sipping expensive champagne and admiring the floral arrangements, a fleet of black unmarked vehicles quietly pulled up to the rear service entrance of the conservatory. The tactical guards stationed at the front doors were entirely focused on looking for a disgruntled daughter-in-law, trying to talk her way past the velvet rope. They had no idea that a highly coordinated operational takeover was happening right behind them. I stepped out of the lead vehicle. I was not wearing an evening gown. I was wearing a sharp-tailored slate gray business suit. I was flanked by Jasmine, 2 federal marshals, acting in their official capacity to oversee the transfer of seized assets, and my own private team of commercial property auditors. We did not approach the security checkpoint. We bypassed the guest entrance entirely and walked directly through the administrative loading dock, utilizing the master building keys I had just legally acquired from the executive board. We moved through the back corridors of the conservatory with silent, terrifying precision. I could hear the muffled sounds of the string quartet and the low hum of wealthy conversation drifting through the walls. We bypassed the catering kitchens and marched directly toward the central security control room. The door was locked, but the master key turned the deadbolt with a satisfying click. We stepped inside, instantly surprising the 3 private security directors monitoring the camera feeds. They jumped up, reaching for their radios, demanding to know who we were and how we had breached the perimeter. Jasmine did not let them speak. She slapped the certified notarized property deed directly onto the security console. She calmly and firmly informed them that the Montgomery firm's lease was officially terminated due to massive financial fraud and payment default. She pointed to the federal marshals standing behind us and explained that any attempt to interfere with the rightful property owner would result in immediate arrest for criminal obstruction. The security directors looked at the deed, looked at the federal badges, and immediately stepped away from the monitors. They were highly paid mercenaries, not loyal soldiers willing to go to federal prison for a bankrupt client. They surrendered control of the building's infrastructure without throwing a single punch. I stood in the center of the control room staring at the wall of glowing security monitors. I could see every angle of the gala. I could see the wealthy patrons laughing. I could see the heavily armed guards standing uselessly at the front doors. And right in the center of the grand ballroom, captured in high definition on camera 4, I could see Harrison Montgomery. He was smiling, shaking hands, and eagerly directing a wealthy tech CEO toward the donation tables. He looked so incredibly smug, so utterly confident in his own untouchability. I reached out and pressed my finger against the glass of the monitor right over his smiling face. He had spent his entire life building fortresses to keep people out, using his wealth to dictate who belonged and who was excluded. He had banned me from his event, thinking he held the ultimate authority over the space. The profound irony of his situation was almost beautiful. He was currently standing in the middle of a massive, opulent ballroom, entirely convinced he was the untouchable king of his castle. He had absolutely no idea that I was not a banned guest desperately trying to get onto his exclusive list. I was the landlord, and his eviction was about to be the main event. The Sterling Conservatory was an architectural masterpiece of the Gilded Age, and tonight it was absolutely dripping in obscene, stolen wealth. Crystal chandeliers cast a warm, flattering glow over the city's most affluent power brokers. Waitstaff in crisp white tuxedos glided silently across the polished herringbone floors, offering silver trays of beluga caviar and vintage champagne. It was a masterclass in illusion. Everyone in this massive, opulent room believed they were contributing to a noble, charitable foundation dedicated to pediatric healthcare, completely blind to the terrifying reality that their massive tax-deductible donations were currently routing directly into Harrison Montgomery's desperate offshore escape fund. At the front of the grand ballroom, standing on a raised stage flanked by towering arrangements of imported white orchids, Harrison was delivering the performance of his lifetime. He gripped the edges of the mahogany podium, his knuckles turning white while he projected the image of a weary but unbroken patriarch. He had actually managed to conjure real tears, letting them pool in his eyes as he spoke into the microphone. He talked passionately about the trials of the past year, weaving a completely fabricated narrative of family resilience. He boldly claimed that the Montgomery Empire was currently weathering a vicious coordinated attack from a deeply unstable, vindictive former family member who simply could not handle the intense pressures of their elite world. He spoke of the tragic fragility of the human mind, shaking his head in mock sorrow. Catherine sat at the head table just below the stage, playing her part flawlessly. Despite her entire world collapsing mere hours ago when Connor walked out on her, she had masked her absolute devastation behind a thick layer of designer makeup and a stoic, brave expression. She dabbed her eyes with a silk handkerchief, nodding along as Harrison painted them as the ultimate victims of my supposed mental breakdown. The wealthy audience was captivated, murmuring in sympathetic agreement, entirely ready to open their checkbooks to support their besieged, suffering friends. I stood in the darkened antechamber just outside the main ballroom doors, listening to Harrison's manipulative lies echoing through the high-definition sound system. Beside me, Jasmine checked her watch, her expression cool and ruthlessly calculating. Behind us stood 4 uniformed local police officers legally present to ensure the peaceful transfer of the commercial premises and to prevent any violent outbursts from the soon-to-be evicted former tenants. I took a slow, deep breath, smoothing my hands down the sides of my gown. For years, Catherine had relentlessly dictated my wardrobe, forcing me into shapeless, muted pastel dresses and conservative pearls that deliberately washed out my complexion. She had always wanted me to look small, invisible, and entirely subordinate to the Montgomery brand. Tonight I was wearing the exact opposite. I had chosen a breathtaking floor-length gown of deep crimson silk that draped flawlessly across my figure. It featured a sharp, asymmetrical neckline and a dramatic slit that radiated absolute, unapologetic power. My hair, usually pulled back into the tight, severe buns Catherine demanded, was styled in loose, cascading waves. I wore a bold, dark red lip. I did not look like a grieving, unstable, barren ex-wife. I looked like a woman who completely owned the room, and legally I did. I gave a sharp nod to the 2 massive security guards flanking the entrance. They grabbed the heavy brass handles and pulled the grand double doors wide open. The heavy oak doors swung outward with a loud, resounding crack that instantly cut through the polite applause following Harrison's speech. The sudden noise drew the eyes of every single person in the massive ballroom. The conversations died instantaneously. The string quartet in the corner faltered, the cellist dragging his bow in a harsh, discordant scrape. I stepped over the threshold, moving into the harsh glare of the chandelier light. Jasmine walked perfectly in step to my right, clutching her sleek leather briefcase, while the four uniformed police officers filed in behind us, their radios crackling softly in the dead silence of the room. The visual impact was absolute. 300 of the city's most powerful socialites and business tycoons stared in stunned, breathless shock as the woman they had just been told was institutionalized walked into the gala looking like an absolute conqueror. The blood completely drained from Harrison's face. He froze at the podium, his mouth hanging slightly open, the microphone picking up his ragged, panicked intake of breath. He looked frantically toward the back of the room, silently demanding that his highly paid tactical security team neutralize the threat before I could ruin his escape plan. Catherine reacted first. The carefully constructed mask of the brave, suffering matriarch shattered into 1,000 jagged pieces. She shot up from her chair at the head table, her face twisting into a mask of pure, unadulterated rage. She pointed a shaking manicured finger directly at me, her voice shrill and hysterical as it echoed across the silent ballroom. "Remove her immediately!" Catherine shrieked, her gaze locking onto the head of the private security detail standing near the coat check. "She is trespassing. She is completely unhinged. I want her physically thrown out into the street and arrested. Do your jobs right now." The tension in the room spiked to a dangerous level. Several wealthy donors gasped, stepping back to avoid the impending physical altercation. Harrison finally found his voice, gripping the microphone and barking desperate orders at the guards, demanding they follow Catherine's instructions and clear the room of the intruders. He yelled that he would double their standard rate if they dragged me out by my hair. The head of security, a massive former military contractor with a thick beard and cold eyes, looked at Harrison on the stage. Then he looked at Catherine, screaming at the front table. Finally, he turned his gaze directly to me. I did not stop walking. I did not flinch. I kept my posture perfectly straight, my crimson dress flowing around me like liquid fire as I marched directly down the center aisle of the ballroom, parting the sea of shocked aristocrats. The security chief slowly crossed his massive arms over his tactical vest. He did not move toward me. Instead, he reached up and tapped his earpiece, communicating a silent, prearranged signal to the rest of his team stationed around the perimeter of the venue. They were professionals. When Jasmine had walked into the security office earlier that afternoon with a signed deed and a new, significantly more lucrative payroll contract, their loyalty shifted instantaneously. They knew exactly who signed their paychecks now. "We have new orders," the security chief announced, his deep voice carrying easily over Catherine's hysterical screaming. "The holding company management has officially changed hands. We do not work for Montgomery Holdings anymore." On his command, the tactical guards stationed at every single exit of the Sterling Conservatory stepped backward. They did not move to escort me out. Instead, they reached behind them, grabbed the heavy brass handles of the massive ballroom doors, and pulled them shut with a deafening thud. The distinct heavy click of the metal deadbolts sliding into place echoed like a gunshot. They were not locking me out. They were locking Harrison and Catherine inside, ensuring that absolutely no one, especially not the man planning to flee the jurisdiction with millions in stolen charitable donations, could leave the premises. A low murmur of panic rippled through the sea of tuxedos and diamond necklaces. This was high society. These people were entirely accustomed to doors opening for them, not locking them inside a room with a heavy police presence. Catherine collapsed back into her chair, her hands covering her mouth in absolute terror as she realized the security team she had just screamed at was now entirely under my command. The local police officers stepped forward, positioning themselves strategically near the main exits, their presence a silent, terrifying warning to anyone considering a physical confrontation. I continued my slow, deliberate walk down the center aisle, my heels clicking sharply against the polished wood floor. The wealthy guests shrank back, giving me a wide berth, their eyes wide with confusion and dawning horror. They were beginning to realize this was not a tragic mental breakdown. This was a highly calculated, legally sanctioned execution of the Montgomery Empire. I bypassed the main stage, entirely ignoring Harrison, who was now gripping the podium so hard his hands were shaking violently. Instead, I walked directly to the professional soundboard and audio-visual mixing desk set up in the corner of the room. The young technician running the equipment took one look at the police officer standing by the doors and immediately stepped away from the console, raising his hands in absolute surrender. I stepped up to the mixing board. I looked up at the stage, meeting Harrison's terrified, bloodshot eyes. I reached out and firmly pressed the master mute button on his channel. The sudden dead silence from his microphone was deafening. He tapped the mic, frantically opening his mouth to yell, but without the amplification, he looked like a pathetic, silent movie caricature of a desperate man, realizing he had entirely lost control. I picked up the secondary microphone resting on the console, the one reserved for the event coordinator. I flipped the switch, letting the feedback hum briefly through the massive speakers before stepping into the light. "Good evening, everyone," I said, my voice smooth, commanding, and ringing with absolute authority across the locked ballroom. "I would like to redirect tonight's donations." Ashley was currently sitting in a federal holding cell, her designer clothes swapped for a sterile orange jumpsuit, but Catherine Montgomery was entirely oblivious to her fake daughter-in-law's catastrophic arrest. Catherine was desperately fighting a losing war on a completely different front. The Montgomery real estate empire was visibly crumbling around her. The corporate accounts were completely frozen, and the relentless gossip among her high society peers was reaching a fever pitch. Her husband was barricaded in his study, drowning in federal subpoenas, while her own platinum credit cards were being declined at every luxury boutique in the city. Catherine knew she was rapidly losing control of the narrative. To survive the impending social slaughter, she needed a distraction. She needed a convenient, highly visible scapegoat to draw the public's attention away from her family's massive financial crimes. She needed everyone to look away from the federal raids and focus their vicious judgment entirely on me. Catherine picked up her diamond-encrusted smartphone and dialed the private number of the editor-in-chief of the city's most notorious high society tabloid. The very next morning, a highly sensationalized, deeply cruel article hit the newsstands and flooded the digital feeds of every prominent socialite in the state. The headline was printed in bold, aggressive lettering, falsely claiming that my recent administrative leave from the Federal Auditing Bureau was actually a mandatory psychiatric suspension. Catherine had provided exclusive anonymous quotes, painting herself as a long-suffering, deeply compassionate mother-in-law who had exhausted all her resources trying to help her severely unstable daughter-in-law. She wove a sickeningly detailed, entirely fabricated narrative, claiming that my supposed mental breakdown was the direct tragic result of my profound infertility. She weaponized the most agonizing, vulnerable years of my life to buy her family a few more days of social sympathy. She told the tabloid that I was physically incapable of giving Connor an heir, and that the devastating reality of my barrenness had driven me to stalk her family. Catherine expected me to hide in my apartment, crippled by the shame of my exposed inadequacies, completely paralyzed by the social stigma she had just manufactured. She fundamentally failed to understand that a woman who has already lost everything has absolutely nothing left to fear. I sat in Jasmine's law firm, calmly reading the pathetic tabloid article while sipping black coffee. I did not shed a tear. I did not feel a shred of embarrassment. I felt a cold surge of pure adrenaline. If Catherine Montgomery wanted to weaponize my medical history in a public forum, I was more than happy to oblige her with verifiable facts rather than fabricated gossip. I looked across the desk at Jasmine and gave her a definitive nod. Jasmine immediately drafted an emergency, legally binding subpoena. We did not just request my basic medical charts from the exclusive Boston fertility clinic Connor and I had utilized during our marriage. Jasmine filed a comprehensive discovery motion demanding every single internal communication financial ledger physician's note and archived security recording associated with the Montgomery family's account at that facility. Because Catherine had publicly discussed my private medical details in a widely circulated publication, she had legally and permanently waived the very privacy protections she relied upon to hide her own toxic secrets. The clinic administration, absolutely terrified of being dragged into a highly publicized federal racketeering investigation regarding the Montgomery family, complied with the sweeping subpoena with astonishing speed. 2 days later, a massive digital file arrived directly in Jasmine's secure legal inbox. We spent hours meticulously combing through the raw data. We found the altered charts, the deeply suspicious email chains, and the blatantly falsified lab reports. But the most devastating, irrefutable piece of evidence was buried deep within the clinic's internal compliance archives. It was an automated digital audio recording of a private consultation that took place exactly 3 years ago, captured by the facility's internal quality assurance system. I pressed play on my laptop, and Catherine's unmistakable, arrogant voice filled the quiet confines of the law office. The recording captured a closed-door meeting between Catherine and the clinic's lead fertility specialist. The doctor was nervously attempting to explain the reality of the situation to her. He was outlining Connor's medical test results, explicitly stating that her son had an absolute zero sperm count, making it biologically impossible for him to father a child. He was trying to discuss alternative treatment options when Catherine abruptly, viciously cut him off. Her voice dripped with elitist contempt and absolute denial. She stated firmly that Connor could not possibly be the problem, insisting that the pure, pristine Montgomery heir could not be genetically defective. "You will alter these charts immediately," Catherine commanded on the recording, her tone colder than ice. "You will blame her average middle-class genetics. You will tell Melanie her egg reserves are completely depleted and her body is simply rejecting the process. She is the failure, not my son. If you protect my son's pride and keep his name off these failure reports, I will personally ensure that your new pediatric wing receives a multi-million-dollar anonymous donation by the end of this fiscal quarter." The audio continued, capturing the sickening, undeniable sound of a highly respected medical professional selling his soul and his ethical oath to protect a fragile male ego. The doctor agreed to officially falsify my medical records. He agreed to subject me to years of grueling, entirely unnecessary hormone injections, invasive physical procedures, and devastating emotional trauma, simply to maintain the grand illusion of Connor's perfect, untouchable Montgomery bloodline. Catherine had literally purchased my prolonged suffering with the promise of a charitable donation, completely destroying my mental and physical health just so her precious son would never have to feel the sting of inadequacy. I did not take this explosive evidence to a courtroom. A civil lawsuit would take years to litigate, and Catherine would use her remaining wealth to delay the proceedings endlessly. I wanted immediate, catastrophic destruction. I wanted her to feel the exact same agonizing public humiliation she had just tried to inflict upon me, but magnified 1,000 times over. I created an untraceable, anonymous email address. I attached the raw audio file along with the corresponding falsified medical charts. I sent the entire package directly to every major investigative journalist, news anchor, and media outlet in the city. I also sent it directly to the personal inbox of every prominent board member at the exclusive Oak Ridge Country Club. The public release was an absolute bloodbath. The audio file spread across the internet like a digital wildfire. The local news stations picked up the story within hours, running the crystal-clear recording on loop during their primetime evening broadcasts. The public backlash was immediate, overwhelming, and intensely vicious. The pathetic narrative Catherine had tried to spin completely collapsed by nightfall. She was no longer viewed as the tragic, supportive mother-in-law weathering a family crisis. The entire city now saw her as a cruel, manipulative monster who had actively bribed a medical professional to mentally and physically torture another woman. The state medical board immediately announced a sweeping emergency investigation into the fertility clinic, promising to permanently revoke the lead doctor's medical license and pursue criminal fraud charges. Catherine was sitting in her lavish parlor, completely unaware of the digital bomb that had just detonated across the city. She was waiting for her high society friends to call and offer their unwavering sympathies regarding the tabloid article she had planted. Instead, her phone rang with a direct, unscheduled call from the president of the Oak Ridge Country Club. The conversation was incredibly brief and absolutely brutal. The club president informed Catherine in a voice completely devoid of any warmth that the board of directors had just held an emergency unanimous vote. Her lifetime family membership, the very cornerstone of her entire social identity, was officially revoked, effective immediately. He cited a strict zero-tolerance policy for moral turpitude and public disgrace. He coldly demanded that she never set foot on the club property again, stating that her mere presence was a toxic, irreparable embarrassment to their prestigious institution. Catherine dropped her phone onto the plush imported carpet. Her entire world, her pristine social standing, her carefully curated reputation, and her elite community had just been completely obliterated in a matter of minutes. The wealthy ladies who regularly lunched with her would now actively cross the street to avoid her. She was a total, undeniable pariah. Absolute panic set in. She desperately needed comfort. She needed someone to validate her existence and tell her that they would survive this horrifying scandal together. She wiped her ruined mascara-stained eyes and ran up the grand sweeping staircase of the mansion, heading straight for Connor's master bedroom. She fully expected to find her golden boy waiting for her, ready to defend her honor against my relentless, vicious attacks. She threw open the heavy oak bedroom door, but the desperate words of comfort instantly died in her throat. Connor was not waiting to console her. He was standing in the middle of the massive room, frantically throwing expensive designer suits and custom leather shoes into a large suitcase. His face was ghostly pale, his eyes heavily bloodshot from days of intense drinking and overwhelming stress. The room was completely trashed, reflecting the absolute chaotic destruction inside his own mind. Catherine stepped forward, reaching out her trembling hands. "Connor, darling, what are you doing? We need to stand together right now," she pleaded, her voice cracking with genuine, unadulterated fear. Connor slowly turned around to face her. The look in his eyes was not love, loyalty, or comfort. It was pure, unfiltered hatred. He reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out a crumpled, heavily creased piece of paper. It was not the fertility clinic report. It was the certified DNA requisition form he had secretly commissioned weeks ago after finding his original birth certificate in Harrison's safe. He held it up, shaking it violently in her face. "You want to stand together!" he screamed, his voice echoing off the vaulted ceilings. "You want to protect the precious Montgomery family name. There is no Montgomery family. You lied to me my entire life. You let me believe I was a failure. You let me believe I was inadequate while you bribed doctors to torture my wife, and you did it all to protect a bloodline that I do not even belong to." He threw the DNA results directly at her chest. "I know the truth about my real biological father. I know I am not a Montgomery. I know I am just a bastard you used to trap Harrison into paying for your luxury lifestyle." Catherine stumbled backward, as if she had been physically struck by a freight train. She hit the doorframe slowly, sliding down onto the floor as her legs completely gave out beneath her. She covered her face with her hands, sobbing hysterically and begging him to understand that she did it all for his benefit to secure his future. But Connor was completely done listening to her toxic, manipulative lies. He zipped up his suitcase with violent, definitive force, dragging it over the hardwood floor. He marched past her without a single backward glance, walking out of the grand estate forever, and leaving Catherine completely alone in the echoing hallway, her relationship with her only son entirely and permanently shattered beyond repair. While Catherine sat weeping on the marble floor of the echoing hallway, entirely broken by the departure of her only son, Harrison Montgomery was operating in a state of manic, terrifying denial. He did not care about the emotional implosion of his family. He did not care that his wife's reputation was destroyed, or that Connor had vanished with a suitcase full of shattered illusions. Harrison cared only about his own immediate self-preservation. The walls of his corporate empire were closing in rapidly. The Federal Auditing Bureau had officially frozen his primary domestic accounts, and the quiet rumblings of impending federal indictments were sending shockwaves through his remaining legal team. He was a cornered predator, but a predator with one final desperate play. Refusing to admit total defeat, Harrison aggressively accelerated the timeline for the annual Montgomery Winter Charity Gala. For decades, this highly exclusive event had been the absolute pinnacle of the city's high society social calendar. It was publicly touted as a glamorous philanthropic fundraiser designed to collect millions for underprivileged community programs. The ballroom was always draped in imported white orchids, crystal chandeliers, and ice sculptures, projecting an aura of infinite wealth. In reality, it was the ultimate crown jewel of Harrison's financial crimes. It was a massive, unregulated slush fund, disguised as high society benevolence. He intended to use this specific gala as a final monumental grift to secure his escape. He planned to collect millions of dollars in untraceable cash luxury asset donations and offshore wire transfers from the city's wealthiest elite under the guise of charitable giving. He needed that untethered capital immediately to hire a team of elite, ruthless criminal defense attorneys and to charter a private, untraceable flight to a non-extradition country before federal prosecutors could officially label him a flight risk and pull his passport. Harrison knew that I was the singular threat to this desperate exit strategy. He knew that I understood the intricate mechanics of his fraudulent ledgers better than anyone else on Earth, and he knew I possessed the documentation to destroy his narrative. Paranoia consumed him completely, turning his usual calculated arrogance into feverish panic. He transformed the historic grand venue into a militarized fortress. He completely abandoned standard event staff and liquidated one of his last hidden offshore accounts to hire a private, highly tactical armed security firm. These were not regular bouncers checking invitations at a velvet rope. They were highly trained security contractors, equipped with discreet earpieces and explicit aggressive orders. Harrison stood in the grand foyer of the venue on the morning of the gala, his eyes bloodshot and his demeanor erratic, personally handing high-resolution photographs of Jasmine and me to the head of the security detail. He distributed our faces to every single guard stationed at the perimeter. He gave them strict, unequivocal orders to keep us off the premises at all costs. He authorized them to use physical force to detain us and instructed them to have us immediately arrested for criminal trespassing the absolute second we stepped onto the sidewalk. He genuinely believed that a wall of armed mercenaries and a tightly controlled, heavily vetted guest list would be enough to neutralize me. He thought he could simply lock the heavy mahogany doors, hide behind his hired muscle, and rob his wealthy peers blind while I was forced to watch helplessly from the street. He completely underestimated how far ahead of him I was already operating. I had absolutely no intention of showing up at the front doors in an evening gown to argue with a wall of hired security guards. Trying to sneak into a party was beneath me, and it was a strategy designed for uninvited guests. I was not a guest. While Harrison was busy barking paranoid orders at his security detail and arranging crystal champagne flutes in the ballroom, Jasmine and I were sitting in a sleek glass-walled boardroom on the top floor of the city's most prestigious commercial real estate firm. We were not dealing with party planners, event coordinators, or entry-level managers. We were meeting directly with the executive board of the historic holding trust that actually owned the magnificent property where the gala was being held. The trust was an old, deeply conservative organization that despised public scandal and strictly valued impeccable financial stability. They had leased the historic venue to the Montgomery firm for the past 20 years, based entirely on the carefully manufactured illusion of Harrison's flawless credit and elite social standing. They were currently entirely unaware of the federal raid on the Montgomery corporate headquarters, and they were completely oblivious to the total freeze on Harrison's bank accounts. I sat at the head of the polished mahogany boardroom table, opened my leather briefcase, and laid out a massive stack of heavily redacted, officially verified financial documents. I did not waste their time with pleasantries or social posturing. I presented the executive board with undeniable mathematical proof that Harrison Montgomery was completely bankrupt and currently under federal investigation. I showed them the frozen routing numbers, the defaulted construction loans, and the impending racketeering charges that Jasmine had meticulously helped me compile. The board members stared at the documents in absolute breathless horror as the reality of their situation dawned on them. Their prestigious historic property was currently being utilized as the staging ground for a massive illegal financial grift orchestrated by a man facing imminent federal imprisonment. But I was not simply there to be a helpful whistleblower warning them of danger. I was there to execute a flawless, highly aggressive corporate maneuver. During my extensive forensic review of Harrison's shadow ledgers, I had discovered a massive fatal vulnerability in his contract with the venue's holding trust. Harrison had structured the long-term lease through one of his many fraudulent shell companies, utilizing falsified corporate collateral to secure the agreement. Furthermore, because his accounts had been frozen by federal auditors, the massive security deposit required to finalize the booking for that evening's gala had officially bounced exactly 48 hours ago. That bounce check triggered an automatic nullification clause buried deep within the fine print of the commercial lease agreement. Technically and legally, Harrison was already in default of his contract. He was currently trespassing in their building. I watched the sickening realization spread across the pale faces of the board members as Jasmine smoothly slid a new, incredibly lucrative contract across the table. I was not asking them to cancel Harrison's event and deal with the subsequent media fallout. I was offering to purchase the master lease and assume total operational control of the venue's holding company, effective immediately. I utilized the clean, highly liquid capital I had secured from my own strategic investments to fund the transaction. I offered the terrified board a massive premium fully paid in certified funds to transfer the property deed and the holding rights directly into my name. In exchange, they would instantly rid themselves of the toxic radioactive liability that was Harrison Montgomery and completely sever any ties to his impending criminal charges. Faced with the immediate threat of being named as co-conspirators in a federal money laundering investigation by blindly hosting his fraudulent charity event, the board did not even need to deliberate. They signed the paperwork with shaking hands, desperate to wash their hands of the Montgomery name. The transfer of power was seamless, brutal, and entirely legal. By 3 o'clock in the afternoon, the ink was completely dry. The certified funds cleared the banking wire without issue. The city clerk's office processed the emergency digital transfer. Jasmine stamped the final page with her heavy notary seal, offering me a sharp, victorious smile that mirrored my own cold satisfaction. I carefully packed the legally binding deed back into my briefcase, feeling the immense, satisfying weight of the document in my hands. The game had entirely shifted. We left the commercial real estate office and headed back to our headquarters to prepare for the evening. Jasmine immediately began drafting the formal eviction notices and coordinating with local law enforcement to ensure our impending arrival was officially documented and legally protected against any violent retaliation from Harrison's private guards. Harrison had spent the entire morning building a heavily armed fortress to keep me out completely unaware that I had just spent the afternoon buying the very ground his fortress was built upon. I was not going to crash his desperate party as a banned uninvited guest. I was going to walk straight through the front doors as the rightful landlord, and I was going to permanently evict the Montgomery family from their own illusion. Connor's knees hit the polished hardwood floor of the Sterling Conservatory with a heavy, defeated thud that echoed loudly through the sudden, suffocating silence of the grand ballroom. His tailored Italian tuxedo, a meticulously crafted garment designed to project generational wealth and unassailable authority, now hung awkwardly on his trembling frame. He was completely stripped of his arrogant bravado, reduced to a hollow shaking shell of the golden boy he had pretended to be for his entire privileged life. The rapid succession of catastrophic blows, his father's brutal federal arrest just moments prior, his mother's total social obliteration, the absolute confirmation of his own illegitimacy, and Ashley's viciously public rejection had finally and irreparably broken him. He had absolutely nothing left. There was no fake legacy to fall back on, no stolen inheritance to inherit, no heir to carry the name, and no powerful family identity to hide behind. In a final, desperate act of absolute pathetic surrender, he reached out with shaking hands and grabbed the heavy crimson silk hem of my gown. His knuckles turned stark white as he clung to the luxurious fabric, his chest heaving with deep, jagged, uncontrollable sobs. He looked up at me, his eyes heavily bloodshot and wide with raw, unadulterated panic. The tears streamed freely down his pale cheeks, ruining his perfectly groomed aristocratic facade. He begged me, his voice cracking and pitching in a high, desperate whine that I barely recognized as the man I once knew. He pleaded with me to tear up the divorce papers, to forget everything that had happened over the last year, to give him just one more chance to make everything right. He promised he would completely change, that we could start over far away from Catherine and the smoking ruins of his family's fraudulent empire. He bargained with empty, meaningless promises, eagerly offering me a future he had absolutely no ability to provide or protect. He was drowning in the catastrophic wreckage of his own toxic lies, and he was desperately trying to use me as a life raft to pull himself out of the deep, dark water. I looked down at the pathetic man I had once promised to spend the rest of my life with. I expected to feel a surge of vindication. I felt no anger. I felt no lingering resentment. I felt an absolute, profound emptiness. The silence in the massive, opulent ballroom was absolute and profoundly heavy. The remaining high society guests, the tactical security guards standing at the doors, and the federal marshals currently processing the scene, all stood completely frozen collectively, watching the spectacular collapse of the Montgomery dynasty's final remaining pillar. If Catherine Montgomery had been standing in my position, she would have greedily seized this exact moment to unleash a theatrical screaming tirade. She would have gloated loudly, hurled vicious, cutting insults, and performed grandly for the captive audience to ensure everyone witnessed her absolute dominance. But I am not Catherine Montgomery. I do not require an audience to validate my personal power, and I absolutely refuse to engage in the kind of cheap emotional theatrics that defined their entire pathetic existence. I simply stood there perfectly still, letting the absolute silence become a physical, crushing weight pressing down on his shaking shoulders. The total absence of my anger was far more terrifying to him than any screaming match could have ever been. It signified a complete and total emotional detachment. I was no longer emotionally invested in his pain. I was no longer interested in his promised redemption. I looked down into his desperate, weeping eyes and watched the very last remaining spark of hope slowly extinguish as he finally realized that I was entirely, fundamentally gone. I did not yank my dress from his grasp. I did not kick him away or create a physical spectacle. I slowly, deliberately leaned down, bringing my face just inches from his ear, completely ignoring the pathetic, jagged breaths tearing violently through his chest. I kept my voice incredibly soft, ensuring that the words were meant exclusively for him, a private final execution of our marriage contract. I only signed papers once, I whispered. The words were perfectly calm, completely devoid of any malice and sharper than a diamond cutting directly through glass. Connor released the crimson silk of my gown, instantly acting as if the fabric had suddenly caught fire in his hands. His arms fell limply to his sides, hitting the polished floorboards with a dull, pathetic slap. The absolute, unyielding finality of my whispered sentence had completely paralyzed him. He slumped forward, curling into himself on the floor, a broken, weeping mess of a man, entirely consumed by his own spectacular ruin. I slowly straightened my posture, my spine perfectly aligned, and stepped around his kneeling form without a single backward glance. I did not look at the federal marshals who were securing the crime scene. I did not look at the wealthy donors whispering furiously in the shadowed corners of the ballroom. I simply locked eyes with Jasmine, who gave me a sharp, deeply approving nod, and together we walked purposefully toward the grand double doors of the conservatory. Behind us, the mechanics of the real world immediately resumed their unfeeling, practical operations. The elite catering staff, recognizing that the party was permanently over and entirely indifferent to the personal tragedies of the wealthy elite, began to efficiently break down the lavish event. Waiters in crisp white jackets silently cleared the crystal champagne flutes and silver trays of caviar from the tables directly surrounding Connor. They moved past his sobbing form as if he were nothing more than a piece of discarded furniture, casually stepping over his tailored shoes to collect the abandoned linen napkins and centerpieces. The absolute coldness of their professional routine underscored his total immediate irrelevance. He was no longer the prestigious guest of honor demanding impeccable service and deference. He was just an obstacle on the floor that needed to be cleaned up before the end of their shift. Jasmine and I pushed through the heavy oak doors, stepping out of the suffocating, opulent fortress and into the sharp, freezing night air. The moment we crossed the threshold, the world exploded in a blinding storm of flashing strobe lights and shouting voices. The local press, having been tipped off by the anonymous digital drop and the highly visible arrival of the federal marshals, had completely swarmed the perimeter of the Sterling Conservatory. Dozens of reporters, investigative journalists, and camera crews pushed aggressively against the police barricades, their microphones thrust forward like weapons into the freezing air. They screamed my name over the din, begging for an exclusive quote, desperately demanding the sensational, sordid details of the Montgomery family's catastrophic implosion. They wanted a tearful story of a scorned woman exacting her bitter emotional revenge. They wanted me to perform the role of the angry, vindictive ex-wife for their morning broadcasts and viral feeds. I absolutely refused to give them the cheap tabloid spectacle they were so desperately hungry for. I maintained my absolute composure, my expression calm, professional, and completely unreadable in the blinding glare of the camera lights. I stopped at the edge of the police barricade and silently reached into my leather briefcase. I pulled out a small, encrypted USB drive. It did not contain personal diary entries, emotional accusations, or scandalous rumors about affairs. It contained the raw, unedited, entirely unsealed public financial records, the offshore routing numbers, the defaulted corporate leases, and the undeniable mathematical proof of Harrison's massive federal embezzlement scheme. I handed the drive directly to the lead investigative reporter from the city's most respected financial journal. I did not offer a single dramatic soundbite. I simply looked at the massive crowd of journalists and stated clearly that the federal documents provided on the drive would offer complete and total transparency regarding the Montgomery real estate operations. I let the cold, hard facts do the talking, completely removing my own emotional narrative from the public equation. Jasmine signaled our waiting black car, and the driver immediately pulled up to the curb, idling the engine. We smoothly slid into the quiet, pristine leather interior of the vehicle, the heavy doors shutting out the frantic screams of the press and the flashing of the cameras. As the car pulled away from the conservatory, merging smoothly into the nighttime city traffic, I looked out the tinted window and took my first truly free breath in years. The long, dark chapter of my life with the Montgomery family was officially and permanently closed. I had not just survived their malicious attempts to destroy me, I had systematically and legally dismantled the very ground they stood upon. The next morning, when the bright sun rose over the city skyline, the explosive headlines splashed across every single major news network and digital publication were not about a messy, dramatic society divorce. They were not about a scorned woman, a fake pregnancy, or a ruined marriage. The bold black letters dominating the front pages detailed the total spectacular dismantling of a corrupt multi-million-dollar real estate empire by a brilliant, uncompromising federal investigator. The morning headlines were just the opening salvo in a swift, merciless legal bombardment that completely leveled the Montgomery family. Harrison's formal arraignment took place less than 72 hours after the federal marshals dragged him out of the Sterling Conservatory in tight handcuffs. He stood before a stern federal judge in a stark, heavily polished, wood-paneled courtroom, looking completely stripped of his untouchable aristocratic aura. His elite defense team, funded by whatever miserable scraps of legal retainers he had managed to secure before his accounts were frozen, argued desperately for house arrest. They loudly cited his extensive ties to the local community, his supposedly fragile health, and his long-standing business reputation. The federal prosecutor did not even bother to argue. She simply slid a printed, heavily verified copy of the digital ledger I had decrypted directly across the judge's elevated bench. The ledger explicitly and undeniably detailed the offshore wire transfers Harrison had attempted to execute during the charity gala, proving he was actively routing illicit funds to a non-extradition territory while pretending to raise money for sick children. The judge barely glanced at the desperate defense attorneys before violently striking his wooden gavel. He declared Harrison an absolute immediate flight risk and denied bail entirely without a single second of hesitation. Harrison's knees visibly buckled as the armed marshals stepped forward to physically escort him away. The transition was absolute and incredibly brutal. He was violently forced to trade his bespoke Italian silk suits and monogrammed gold cufflinks for a stiff, scratchy federal prison uniform in a blinding, humiliating shade of institutional orange. He was thoroughly processed, photographed, fingerprinted, and locked inside a bleak, concrete federal holding facility to await a highly publicized trial he was mathematically guaranteed to lose. Facing a minimum of a decade behind bars for racketeering, extensive wire fraud, and massive corporate tax evasion, Harrison Montgomery would spend the rest of his natural life pacing a tiny, windowless cell, entirely stripped of the power and prestige he had sacrificed his own family to maintain. Catherine experienced a completely different yet equally devastating flavor of utter, inescapable ruin. The strict federal asset forfeiture protocols triggered immediately following Harrison's highly publicized arrest, completely seizing the sprawling, opulent Montgomery estate. She was given exactly 2 hours by the unsmiling federal agents to pack whatever personal non-luxury items she could physically fit into 2 standard suitcases. She was legally forced to leave behind the priceless modern artwork, the imported crystal chandeliers, and the antique diamond jewelry collections she had lorded over the city's high society for decades. With her platinum credit cards loudly declining at every single terminal and her bank accounts permanently locked in the federal freeze, she had absolutely nowhere to go. She ended up signing a month-to-month lease on a cramped, dingy one-bedroom apartment in a decaying industrial neighborhood on the extreme dangerous outskirts of the city. The contrast was a violent physical shock to her delicate system. Instead of waking up to manicured rose gardens and a private culinary chef, she woke up to the deafening sounds of screeching police sirens, rattling subway trains, and dirty water dripping from a stained, yellowing plaster ceiling. Her new reality was a brutal, unforgiving nightmare. Desperate for a social lifeline, she sat on a stained secondhand sofa she had been forced to purchase from a local thrift store and pulled out her phone. She scrolled frantically through her extensive contact list, dialing the personal numbers of the wealthy women she used to host for lavish afternoon teas. She called the president of the Oak Ridge Country Club. She called the wives of local politicians and elite real estate developers. She begged their voicemail boxes for a small temporary loan, a safe place to stay, or just a sympathetic ear. Every single call went straight to voicemail. Her desperate weeping messages were left unread, completely ignored by the social circle that had instantly expelled her, the absolute moment her membership was revoked, and her husband was federally indicted. The women who used to hang on her every word now actively pretended she did not exist. Catherine was completely isolated, trapped in a squalid little box, entirely suffocated by the heavy, inescapable weight of her own permanent social obliteration. Connor's rapid descent into cold, hard reality was arguably the most pathetic spectacle of them all. When he stormed out of the grand estate on the night of the gala, leaving his weeping, broken mother behind, he genuinely believed he could simply start over. He arrogantly thought his boyish charm, his recognized Montgomery name, and his incredibly expensive Ivy League education would effortlessly secure him a high-paying executive position at a rival commercial firm. He completely failed to realize that his entire professional existence had been entirely propped up by his father's blatant systematic nepotism. When he confidently walked into professional interviews and handed over a polished resume consisting entirely of fake inflated executive titles at a now defunct federally indicted shell company, he was immediately laughed out of the room. No legitimate corporate entity would touch him with a 10-foot pole. With his massive trust fund completely liquidated by the federal government, and his expensive imported sports car repossessed by the bank, Connor was forced to face the real world with absolutely no actual marketable skills. He eventually secured the only job willing to hire him. It was a grueling, physically demanding entry-level retail position at a massive, incredibly impersonal home improvement warehouse. The former golden boy who used to spend his lazy afternoons drinking expensive scotch on private manicured golf courses was now forced to wear a bright blue polyester vest and a cheap plastic name tag. He spent 10 miserable hours a day standing on hard concrete floors, unloading heavy cardboard boxes of metal hardware, answering aggressively stupid questions from highly irritated customers, and cleaning up massive spills in the public restrooms. The physical labor exhausted his soft, highly privileged body, but the stark financial reality was far worse. The IRS, systematically unwinding Harrison's massive fraudulent tax returns, had correctly identified Connor as a knowing, active beneficiary of the stolen corporate funds. The federal government placed a massive, inescapable lien on his meager hourly earnings. Furthermore, the aggressive defense lawyers he had briefly retained to try and fight his public paternity scandal had successfully sued him for unpaid legal fees. Every Friday, when Connor received his miserable retail paycheck, nearly 70% of his wages were heavily garnished before the money even hit his completely depleted checking account. He could barely afford the monthly rent on a tiny, damp basement studio apartment. He ate cheap canned soup every night, nursing his aching back and staring blankly at the wall. While the Montgomery family was completely swallowed by the toxic, inescapable consequences of their own making, I was operating in a state of absolute surgical precision. I had not just destroyed their crumbling empire, I had systematically absorbed the clean, entirely legitimate pieces of it. The Sterling Conservatory Holding Company, which I had legally acquired in a completely flawless, unassailable hostile takeover, was a massive, highly sought-after commercial asset in the city's real estate market. Now that the toxic radioactive cloud of the Montgomery lease had been permanently severed, the historic property's actual market value skyrocketed. I did not want to manage a lavish event venue. I wanted liquid capital. I immediately listed the holding company on the elite commercial market. Within 48 hours, a massive international hospitality conglomerate offered me an exorbitant, record-breaking sum to purchase the deed outright. I signed the transfer papers without a second thought, legally liquidating the physical asset and depositing an astronomical amount of clean, fully verified capital directly into my private encrypted corporate accounts. I sat in Jasmine's corner office, drinking a cup of hot black coffee, watching the final wire transfer clear the global banking system with a satisfying, definitive chime on my laptop screen. I pored over the final financial audit, systematically cataloging the immense, staggering wealth I had legally extracted from the chaotic fallout of their absolute destruction. I was no longer just a brilliant federal investigator operating quietly on a standard government salary. I had meticulously amassed a massive, impenetrable war chest of perfectly clean capital, perfectly positioned for a new venture. I looked out the expansive floor-to-ceiling windows of the prestigious law firm, watching the busy, bustling city streets below. I had ruthlessly torn down a corrupt dynasty, completely reclaimed my absolute independence, and secured an ironclad financial foundation that made me completely untouchable. I closed my laptop with a sharp, definitive snap, turning to Jasmine, with a calm, highly calculating smile. The grand revenge was officially complete, and I was perfectly positioned to build an entirely new empire on the ashes of their ruin. This was the absolute undeniable beginning of a formidable, incredibly powerful legacy that nobody would ever steal again. Exactly 1 year later, the crisp autumn sunlight poured through the massive floor-to-ceiling glass windows of my corner office, illuminating a space that belonged entirely and undeniably to me. The transition from a dedicated, highly effective federal employee to a completely independent corporate powerhouse had been swift, calculated, and immensely satisfying. I had walked into the Federal Auditing Bureau headquarters the week after Harrison Montgomery was formally indicted, handed my heavily decorated badge directly to my superior, and submitted my formal letter of resignation. I did not leave because I disliked the work or the mission of the agency. I left because the federal sector, with its rigid bureaucratic ceilings, endless red tape, and slow-moving chains of command, was no longer vast enough to contain the sheer scope of my ambition. I had utilized the massive influx of clean, highly liquid capital from the sale of the Sterling Conservatory Holding Company to immediately launch my own elite independent forensic auditing and crisis management firm. I named it Apex Financial Intelligence. I did not build this formidable company alone. Jasmine, having completely outgrown the conservative, stifling constraints of her former prestigious law firm, had decisively resigned her lucrative partnership to join me as my co-founder and chief legal counsel. Together, we created a formidable, utterly impenetrable corporate entity designed specifically to dismantle high-level corruption and navigate catastrophic financial crises for the world's most elite clientele. Our reputation preceded us with astonishing speed. We were not just another standard accounting firm shuffling spreadsheets for tax season. We were the elite surgical strike force that legitimate multinational corporations hired when they suspected massive internal fraud or catastrophic embezzlement. We were the absolute ultimate authority on forensic asset recovery and corporate defense. We did not advertise on billboards, and we absolutely did not accept walk-in clients. Our highly specialized services were secured entirely through whispered, desperate recommendations in elite boardrooms and exclusive private members clubs across the globe. Within the first 6 months of operation, we had successfully recovered hundreds of millions of dollars in stolen corporate assets for various international conglomerates, earning a fierce reputation for being absolutely ruthless, highly discreet, and terrifyingly brilliant. My new life was a breathtaking, undeniable contrast to the suffocating, toxic existence I had endured during my miserable marriage to Connor. I was no longer the quiet, overlooked daughter-in-law forced to constantly tolerate Catherine Montgomery's relentless, elitist psychological abuse. I was no longer the convenient, unassuming scapegoat for a family of desperate, pathetic criminals trying to hide their staggering incompetence. I was a respected, feared, and highly sought-after executive in my own right. My personal financial portfolio was absolutely ironclad, intelligently diversified across global markets, and entirely untouchable by any external force. I owned my sleek, modern penthouse apartment outright, a stunning space decorated exactly to my own tastes, free from the oppressive, gaudy antiques Catherine had always favored. I drove myself to work in a custom-tailored, high-performance luxury vehicle that I had purchased with my own hard-earned clean capital. I was answerable to absolutely no one. Every single decision I made, both personally and professionally, was entirely my own. The sheer, unadulterated freedom of absolute independence was overwhelmingly intoxicating. Occasionally, the ghost of the shattered Montgomery family would flicker across the periphery of my radar, usually in the form of a minor, pathetic footnote in a local financial newsletter updating the public on Harrison's lengthy, miserable prison sentence or the ongoing, humiliating auction of their remaining seized assets. I felt absolutely nothing when I read those updates. I felt no lingering anger, no vindictive joy, and certainly no pity whatsoever. They were simply strangers who had fundamentally failed to break my spirit. Catherine was still reportedly languishing in her damp, miserable one-bedroom apartment, completely ostracized from the society she had worshipped, spending her days isolated and entirely forgotten by the world. Connor continued to desperately toil away in retail obscurity, his wages forever chained to his father's colossal federal penalties, unable to ever escape the crushing debt he had inherited. Their spectacular downfall was entirely their own doing, a direct, undeniable consequence of their monumental greed and their fatal, arrogant underestimation of my capabilities. I had simply held up a mirror to their corruption and allowed the natural, devastating consequences to completely obliterate them. I sat back in my plush, imported leather executive chair, adjusting the cuffs of my tailored silk blazer. The office around me was a beautiful physical manifestation of my hard-won success. The walls were decorated in stark, minimalist tones featuring striking abstract art that I had carefully selected to inspire focus and clarity. The expansive mahogany desk was completely clear of clutter, save for my secure encrypted laptop and a few essential highly classified client dossiers waiting for my review. The panoramic view of the bustling city skyline stretched out endlessly before me, a magnificent concrete jungle of towering skyscrapers and busy avenues over which I now commanded absolute undeniable authority. The heavy glass door to my office swung open with a smooth, silent motion. Jasmine strode confidently into the room, her designer heels clicking sharply against the polished hardwood floor. She was wearing a brilliant, triumphant smile and carrying a chilled bottle of vintage, incredibly expensive champagne in one hand, along with two delicate crystal flutes in the other. She set the glasses down on the edge of my pristine desk with a satisfying musical clink. We just received the official signed countersignatures from the Vanguard Tech Executive Board. Jasmine announced, her voice practically vibrating with uncontained excitement. The massive corporate merger audit is officially ours. They accepted every single one of our stringent terms, including the absolute highest tier of our retainer demands, without a single word of negotiation. They are wiring the initial $10 million engagement fee directly to our primary corporate accounts before the close of business today. I allowed a slow, deeply satisfied smile to spread across my face. Vanguard Tech was the largest, most lucrative technology conglomerate on the entire West Coast. Securing their merger audit was not just a massive financial victory, it was a definitive, undeniable industry coronation. It officially cemented Apex Financial Intelligence as the absolute premier forensic firm in the country, effectively leaving all our older established competitors completely in the dust. This was a multi-million-dollar contract that would require months of intense, highly classified work, exactly the kind of complex, high-stakes intellectual warfare that I absolutely thrived on. I watched as Jasmine expertly popped the cork on the champagne bottle, the celebratory sound echoing brightly in the spacious, sunlit office. She poured the bubbling golden liquid into the crystal flutes, handing one directly to me with a look of profound mutual respect. "To the absolute best decision we ever made," she said, raising her glass in a crisp, sharp salute. "To betting entirely on ourselves, leaving the secure path behind, and completely running the board." "To betting on ourselves," I agreed, my voice calm, resolute, and perfectly steady. I clinked my glass against hers, the clear, bright sound ringing out like a bell of victory. I took a slow, appreciative sip of the champagne, letting the cold, crisp taste settle on my tongue as the reality of our immense achievement washed over me. I stood up from my desk and walked slowly toward the massive floor-to-ceiling windows, looking out over the sprawling, magnificent city below. The streets were filled with thousands of people rushing through their daily lives, completely unaware of the massive high-stakes corporate battles being fought and decisively won in the glass towers far above them. I stood there, bathed entirely in the warm, golden afternoon sunlight, feeling a profound, unshakable sense of peace settle deeply and permanently into my bones. The dark, suffocating years spent desperately trying to prove my worth to a family of toxic, manipulative parasites felt like a distant, entirely irrelevant lifetime ago. I was completely, undeniably, and unapologetically free. The Montgomery family had tried to use my vulnerabilities, my body, and my deeply personal medical history to shield their own monstrous financial crimes. They had tried to violently strip me of my dignity, my career, and my fundamental sense of self. They had thrown every single weapon in their vast corrupt arsenal at me, fully expecting me to break surrender and quietly disappear into the shadows of their grand narrative. They had been catastrophically wrong. I had taken their malicious calculated attacks and forged them into an impenetrable gleaming armor. I had weaponized my own brilliant mind, my unwavering dedication to the truth, and my professional expertise to utterly dismantle their entire world, brick by brick, lie by lie. But standing here now at the absolute pinnacle of my own hard-earned empire, I realized something incredibly profound. The greatest, most satisfying revenge I had ever achieved was not exposing Harrison's massive federal fraud. It was not getting Catherine kicked out of her elite country club or permanently exiled from the high society she so desperately craved. It was not handing Connor the undeniable proof of his own illegitimacy and watching his fragile ego completely shatter on the ballroom floor. The true ultimate revenge was simply existing in this exact moment, completely untouched by their ruin. It was the absolute undeniable realization that my success, my immense wealth, and my profound happiness had absolutely nothing to do with them. I had built a formidable, internationally recognized corporate powerhouse entirely from my own intellect and sheer, unyielding determination. I had secured a future so exceptionally bright and heavily fortified that the darkness of my past could no longer cast even the slightest shadow over my life. I took another slow sip of the expensive champagne, letting my eyes trace the distant, glittering horizon. I was the architect of my own empire, the master of my own fate, and a woman who had definitively proven that true power does not come from marrying into a legacy. True power comes from having the absolute courage to burn a corrupt legacy to the ground and building something magnificent from the ashes. I smiled, turning back to face my brilliant partner and the incredible future we had built, knowing with absolute certainty that I had never needed them in the first place.